My son looked down at me from the deck of my own boat, his face completely void of emotion, while I treaded water 10 miles from the Florida coast. He didn't throw a life preserver. He didn't call the Coast Guard. He just smiled a cold, empty smile that I had never seen on the boy I raised and said, "Say hello to the sharks, Dad." Then he turned the wheel and left me to die in the middle of the ocean. He thought that was the end of William Carter. He thought he had just inherited a multi-million-dollar marine salvage empire. But he made one fatal mistake. He didn't check if I drowned. When he returned home to pop the champagne with his wife, I was already waiting in the shadows, and I had prepared a hell of a surprise for them. Before I tell you how I crawled back from the grave to destroy the people who tried to kill me, let me know in the comments if you have ever trusted the wrong person. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that betrayal should never go unpunished. The heat in the Florida Keys was oppressive that morning, a heavy blanket of humidity that made the air shimmer above the water. We were 10 miles out on the Legacy, a 40-foot salvage vessel I had bought with the blood and sweat of 30 years working the wrecks. The twin engines hummed a steady rhythm, usually a sound that brought me peace, but today it felt like a countdown. I stood at the helm, my hands gripping the wheel, trying to teach Brandon how to read the sonar for deep water currents. "Look here, son," I said, pointing to the screen. "You have to watch the thermocline. That is where the big game fish sit, but it is also where the dangerous currents start. If you want to run this company one day, you need to respect the water." Brandon didn't even look up. He was leaning against the gunwale, tapping furiously on his phone, the screen reflecting in his sunglasses. I knew who he was texting. Megan, his wife, my daughter-in-law, the woman who had whispered in his ear that I was too old, too stuck in my ways, and that the company needed new blood. "Brandon," I barked using my old Marine Corps voice, "are you listening to me?" He sighed, a sound of pure annoyance, and shoved the phone into his pocket. "I heard you, Dad. Watch the currents. Respect the water. You have said it 1,000 times. Can we just fish?" "I need a break." I looked at him, searching for the boy I used to take camping, the boy who used to look at me like I was a hero. All I saw was a 38-year-old man with soft hands and a mountain of gambling debts he thought I didn't know about. I had refused to loan him $500,000 2 days ago. I told him he needed to earn his way out of the mess he created. That refusal hung between us like a thick fog. "Fine," I said, cutting the engines. "Let's fish." But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a storm waiting to break. We had been drifting for an hour when Brandon stood up abruptly. He walked to the stern, checking the heavy-duty trolling rods we had set up. "Dad," he called out, his voice sounding strange, tight. "The port side line is fouled on the prop. I think we snagged a pot buoy." I frowned. I hadn't seen any markers, but the currents out here could drag debris from miles away. I put down my water bottle and walked to the back of the boat. Brandon stepped aside, gesturing to the edge. "I can't reach it," he said. "You have the reach." I leaned over the transom, peering down into the dark blue water. The prop looked clear from what I could see. "I don't see anything, Brandon," I said, leaning out further, trying to get a better angle. "Are you sure it's snagged?" That was when I felt it. Not a stumble, not an accident. 2 hands placed firmly on the middle of my back. Then a violent, powerful shove. I didn't even have time to shout. The world flipped upside down, sky turning to water, heat turning to shock. I hit the ocean hard, the salt water filling my nose and mouth. The cold was instant, cutting through the adrenaline. I kicked wildly, surfacing, gasping for air, shaking the water from my eyes. I spun around, treading water, looking up at the boat. Brandon was standing right there at the stern, looking down at me. He wasn't reaching for the ladder. He wasn't throwing the ring buoy. He was just watching. "Brandon, I yelled, spitting out salt water. "What are you doing? Help me back up." He didn't move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out my cell phone, which I had left on the console. He held it over the water for a second, then dropped it. It made a small splash and disappeared toward the bottom. Then he looked at me and I saw it. The liberation. He looked relieved. "Say hello to the sharks, Dad," he said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. He walked back to the helm. I heard the engines roar to life. The Legacy turned the prop wash, hitting me in the face, pushing me further away. I screamed his name, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the diesel engines. He didn't look back once. He just drove away, leaving a white wake that slowly faded, leaving me alone in the middle of the Atlantic. 10 miles. That is a death sentence for anyone, let alone a 68-year-old man with bad knees. Panic tried to claw its way into my throat, but I forced it down. Panic kills faster than drowning. I am a Marine. We don't panic, we assess, we adapt, we survive. I scanned the horizon. Nothing but blue water and the merciless sun beating down. I checked my pockets. A pocket knife and a lighter. Useless. My boots were dragging me down, so I kicked them off, watching them sink into the abyss. I needed flotation. I needed something, anything. Then I saw it. About 50 yards away, bobbing in the waves, the white Yeti cooler. It must have been knocked overboard when I went over, or maybe Brandon kicked it over to clear the deck. It didn't matter. It was salvation. I swam toward it, forcing my strokes to be steady, ignoring the burning in my lungs. When I reached it, I grabbed the handle. It was buoyant. Thank God for expensive insulation. I wrapped my arms around it, keeping my head above the swells. I floated there for hours. The sun began to dip low, turning the water a blood-red color that made my stomach turn. I knew what happened when the sun went down. The predators came up to feed. I kept my legs tucked up tight against my chest, making myself a smaller target. Every shadow beneath me looked like a monster. Every splash sounded like a fin cutting the surface. I started talking to myself to stay awake, to keep the hallucinations at bay. I recounted the inventory of my warehouse. I listed the engine specs of every boat I had ever salvaged. But my mind kept drifting back to 2 days ago. The paperwork. Megan had brought over a stack of documents for the company. Just routine updates, Bill, she had said, smiling that viper smile. "We just need you to sign off on Brandon having temporary operational control while you take your fishing trip, just in case of an emergency." Temporary control. I had signed my own death warrant. It wasn't just Brandon. It was her. They had planned this. The rage hit me hotter than the sun. They didn't just kill me. They tricked me into handing them the knife. Night fell like a heavy curtain. The water temperature dropped, sucking the heat from my body. My teeth chattered so hard my jaw ached. I was drifting in and out of consciousness, the line between the black water and the black sky blurring. I thought about letting go. It would be so easy to just let the ocean take me, to stop fighting. But then I saw Brandon's face again. That smirk. That arrogant, entitled smirk. No, I wasn't going to die. Not like this. Not to give them the satisfaction. I saw a light on the horizon. A small, rhythmic flash. A lighthouse. No, it was moving. A boat. I tried to shout, but my throat was parched, swollen shut from the salt. I waved my arms, splashing the water, risking attracting the sharks, desperate for attention. The light got closer. It wasn't a Coast Guard cutter. It was running without navigation lights, moving fast and quiet. A cigarette boat. Smugglers. In the Keys, if you see a boat running dark at 3 a.m., you look the other way. But I didn't have a choice. I used my lighter, flicking it rapidly, praying the flint was dry enough. A tiny spark. Then a small flame. I waved it in the darkness. The boat slowed down. It circled back. A spotlight hit me, blinding me. 2 men pulled me onto the deck. They weren't gentle. They threw me onto the fiberglass like a sack of wet cement. One of them pointed a gun at my head. He was shouting in Spanish, asking who I was, if I was DEA. I coughed up water, raising my hands. "I am not a cop," I rasped. "My name is William Carter. I own Carter Marine Salvage." The man with the gun hesitated. He knew the name. Everyone who worked the waters in the Keys knew my company. We had pulled half the local fleet off the reefs at one point or another. "Why are you swimming in the middle of the run, Carter?" he asked, lowering the gun slightly. I looked him in the eye. "I fell overboard," I lied. "I didn't want to tell these criminals my son tried to kill me. Weakness gets you killed in their world. Listen to me. I have money. Cash. Lots of it. If you take me to shore, drop me at the old derelict pier in Marathon, and don't tell a soul you saw me, I will pay you $50,000. Tonight." The men exchanged looks. 50,000 was a lot of money for a detour. "Show us the money first," the leader said. "I don't carry 50 grand in my swim trunks," I snapped, sitting up, shivering violently. "It is in a safe at my private warehouse. Take me there. You have the guns. If I am lying, you can put a bullet in me and dump me back in the water. But if you get me to shore, you get paid. And I forget I ever saw your faces. It was a gamble, a massive one. But greed is a universal language." The leader nodded. "Get him a blanket," he ordered. "We make the drop." The ride back was a blur of pounding waves and nausea. We pulled into the old industrial canal at 3 a.m. It was desolate, a graveyard of rusted trawlers and broken dreams. Perfect for a ghost. I led them to my secondary warehouse, a place Brandon didn't know about. I kept my emergency fund there, hidden under a false floor beneath a hydraulic press. I opened the hatch, pulled out the vacuum-sealed bricks of cash, and tossed 5 bundles to the smuggler. 50,000. "Count it." The man smiled, tucking the money into his jacket. "Pleasure doing business, Carter. You look like hell. You should see a doctor." "I am dead," I said, staring into the darkness of the warehouse. "Dead men don't need doctors." They left the boat's engines purring into the night. I locked the heavy steel door from the inside and slid down against it, finally allowing myself to collapse. I woke up on the concrete floor a few hours later. My body screamed in pain. Every muscle was cramped, my skin was burned and raw from the salt. I dragged myself to the utility sink and drank water until my stomach hurt. Then I looked in the cracked mirror hanging over the workbench. The man staring back was unrecognizable. Sunken eyes, peeling skin, wild white hair. Good. William Carter needed to disappear. I found a pair of heavy shears and shaved my head completely bald. I shaved off the beard I had worn for 40 years. I put on a pair of grease-stained coveralls and a trucker hat I found in a locker. I looked like a drifter, a nobody. Just another washed-up mechanic in the Keys. I went to the wall safe behind the tool rack and pulled out a burner phone and a black notebook. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice. "Sam," I said when the line clicked open. "It's Bill. Don't hang up." There was a long silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Bill. The news said you were lost at sea. They are calling off the search at noon." "I am not lost, Sam. I was discarded. But I am back. I need your help." Samantha Rossi was the best private investigator in the state. She used to be a cop until she got fired for breaking the nose of a corrupt lieutenant. She owed me a favor for pulling her boat off a sandbar during a hurricane pro bono. "I need eyes on my house, Sam. I need to know what they are doing, who they are talking to, everything." Sam didn't ask stupid questions. She didn't ask how I survived. She just asked, "What is the job I took?" A deep breath, the cold rage settling in my chest like a stone. "I want to watch my own funeral, Sam. I want to see them cry. And then I want to burn their world to the ground. Get the surveillance gear ready. We have work to do. The salt spray stung my eyes as I leaned further over the transom, straining to see where the monofilament line had fouled the propeller. The twin Yamaha engines were idling a low, throaty rumble that vibrated through the fiberglass deck and into my chest. I couldn't see the tangle yet, just the churning blue water and the dark shape of the prop blades beneath the surface. "Hand me the boat hook, Brandon." I called out, not looking back, my eyes fixed on the water. "I need to get some leverage before this cuts the seal." There was no answer, just the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the cry of a distant frigate bird. A strange, prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck, the kind of instinct that had kept me alive in the Marines when the jungle went too quiet. I started to straighten up, intending to turn around and ask him what he was doing, but I never got the chance. The pressure came suddenly, not a stumble or a bump, but a deliberate, violent shove against my lower back. It was executed with a force that could only come from hatred. My boots lost their grip on the wet, non-skid deck. My hands grasped at empty air, fingers clawing for the railing that was suddenly out of reach. For a split-second, time seemed to suspend, and I was weightless, suspended between the world of the living and the deep, unforgiving ocean. Then gravity took hold, and I plunged face first into the Atlantic. The impact was like hitting concrete. The water was colder than I expected, a shocking embrace that drove the air from my lungs. I went under the blue world, turning into a chaotic swirl of bubbles and foam. My heavy work boots, usually my protection, instantly became anchors, dragging me down toward the darkness. I kicked frantically, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird fighting the disorientation. I clawed my way to the surface, breaking through the water, with a desperate gasp coughing up brine and bile. I shook the stinging salt water from my eyes and spun around, treading water, searching for the boat. The Legacy was drifting about 20 feet away. Brandon stood at the stern, his silhouette framed by the blinding Florida sun. He wasn't rushing to the controls. He wasn't throwing the life ring. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the gunwale, watching me struggle. He looked like a statue, devoid of panic, devoid of humanity. "Brandon." I screamed, my voice raw and gargled. "The current is strong. Throw the line. Get the line." He didn't move. He just watched, studying me as if I were a piece of driftwood he had decided to discard. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out my phone, the rugged case glinting in the sunlight. It was my lifeline, my connection to the world, to my bank accounts, to my contacts. He held it over the water, dangling it by a corner. The look on his face was terrifyingly calm, a mask of cold indifference that chilled me more than the ocean ever could. "Say hello to the sharks, Dad," he said. His voice carried clearly over the water, flat and final. He opened his fingers. The phone tumbled through the air, hitting the water with a small, insignificant splash before sinking into the abyss. Without another word, he turned his back on me. I heard the engines rev, the pitch rising from a rumble to a roar. The props bit into the water, churning up a white, frothy wake that washed over me, pushing me further back. I watched in disbelief as my own boat, piloted by my own son, sped away toward the horizon, leaving me treading water in the middle of a vast, empty silence. The roar of the engines faded into a distant hum, and then into nothingness, leaving me suspended in a silence so profound it felt heavy. The ocean was no longer a workspace or a playground. It was a tomb. I spun in a slow circle, treading water, my clothes heavy with saturation, scanning the horizon for a speck of white fiberglass that wasn't there. He was really gone. My son had left me to die. A scream clawed at my throat, a primal urge to thrash and yell, but I swallowed it down with a mouthful of bitter salt water. Panic burns oxygen. Panic accelerates heart rate. Panic kills. I forced my breathing to slow down, finding a rhythm amidst the chaos. Inhale. Exhale. I calculated the distance. 10 miles to the nearest key against a strong outgoing tide. I was 68 years old. I was strong, but I wasn't a machine. Swimming for shore wasn't a plan, it was a slow suicide. I needed to float. I needed to conserve energy. I scanned the swells, my eyes burning from the salt. The sun was a hammer beating down on my exposed head. Then I saw it. A flash of white bobbing in the trough of a wave about 50 yards down current. It was the large Yeti cooler we kept on the deck, filled with ice and beer. Brandon must have knocked it over in his haste to escape, or maybe he kicked it off as a final insult. It didn't matter. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I swam toward it, my strokes measured and desperate, ignoring the cramping in my calves. The current fought me, pushing the white box away, but I fought harder. When my fingers finally grazed the plastic handle, I let out a sob of relief. I grabbed it, pulling it close, hugging the hard plastic like it was a long-lost lover. It was buoyant enough to support my weight. I hooked my arms through the handles, letting my legs dangle, resting my chin on the lid. Inside, I could hear the sloshing of melting ice and beer cans, a cruel reminder of the leisure trip that had turned into an execution. Hours bled into one another. The relentless sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The beauty of it was mocking. With the sunset came the temperature drop. The water that felt refreshing at noon now felt like ice seeping into my bones. My teeth began to chatter, a rhythmic clicking that echoed in my skull. But the cold wasn't the worst part. As the light failed, the water beneath me turned from a clear blue to an opaque, inky black. I felt a change in the pressure, a displacement of water near my legs. I looked down into the gloom. A gray shape moved silently beneath me, darker than the surrounding water. Then a dorsal fin sliced the surface 10 feet away, cutting through the calm water with terrifying precision. Then another. They had come to investigate the disturbance. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that erased the horizon line between the black water and the starless sky. The cold was no longer just a sensation on my skin, it was a parasite burrowing deep into my marrow, slowing my heart, turning my blood to sludge. My teeth chattered with a violence that made my jaw ache, a constant rhythmic clicking that sounded like a ticking clock counting down my remaining minutes. I clung to the cooler, my arms numb and unresponsive, my legs dangling into the void where the sharks circled. Every time a rough sandpaper hide brushed against my boots, a jolt of primal terror spiked through my freezing body, but I was too exhausted to even recoil. In the delirium of hypothermia, my mind began to drift, detaching from the agony of the present and floating back to the air-conditioned comfort of my kitchen just 48 hours ago. I saw it so clearly. The mahogany table, the smell of fresh coffee. Megan standing there with a folder in her hands, smiling that sweet smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Just sign here, Bill," she had said, her voice smooth as silk. "It gives Brandon temporary operational authority while you are out on the water. Just standard procedure in case a client needs an urgent signature and you are out of range." I remembered looking at Brandon. He was pacing by the window, nervous, sweating. I thought he was just anxious about the responsibility. I was a fool. He was terrified because he knew he was handing his father a death warrant. I signed the papers. I signed away my company, my accounts, my life. I gave them the legal keys to the kingdom, and 2 days later they threw the king overboard. The rage flared in my chest, momentarily warming me against the Atlantic chill. It was a trap. A meticulously crafted legal trap designed by my daughter-in-law and executed by my son. A low rumble vibrated through the water, pulling me back from the edge of unconsciousness. It wasn't the rhythmic crash of waves. It was mechanical. A deep, throbbing hum. I lifted my head, my neck stiff and painful. A light appeared in the distance, not the sweeping beam of a lighthouse or the red and green navigation lights of a Coast Guard cutter. It was a faint, erratic glow like the tip of a cigarette in a dark room. Then I heard the hull slapping the water. A boat. But it was moving fast and running dark without navigation lights. In the Florida Keys, that meant only one thing. Smugglers. I didn't care if they were running drugs, guns, or people. They were dry land. I summoned the last reserves of my strength, pushing air into my burning lungs. I tried to shout, but my voice was a cracked whisper. I let go of the cooler with one hand splashing the water frantically, kicking my legs despite the risk of the predators beneath. Over here, I screamed, my voice raw. "Help me!" The boat kept moving, the rumble growing louder, then fading as it passed me by. Despair crashed over me, heavier than the waves. Then the engine pitch changed. The boat slowed. It circled back. A powerful spotlight cut through the darkness, blinding me instantly. I shielded my eyes, squinting into the glare. The boat drifted closer, the engines idling. Strong hands grabbed the back of my life vest, hauling me upward. I was dragged over the gunwale, scraping my ribs against the fiberglass before being dumped onto the wet deck like a catch of the day. I coughed, retching up seawater, shivering uncontrollably. I tried to push myself up to thank them, but a heavy boot slammed into my shoulder, pinning me to the deck. I looked up, blinking against the harsh light, into the barrel of a semi-automatic pistol. A man with a scar running down his cheek stared down at me, his finger tightening on the trigger. The barrel of the gun was cold and unwavering, inches from my face, but I didn't flinch. Panic is a luxury for the living, and I had already accepted that the man named William Carter died the moment he hit the water. What remained was something else entirely, something harder. I looked past the muzzle, into the eyes of the man holding it. He was young, edgy, probably high on his own supply. But the man behind him, the one steering the boat, he was older. Calloused. A professional. That was who I needed to talk to. I didn't raise my hands in surrender. I sat up, coughing salt water onto their pristine deck, and looked the older man dead in the eye. "I know what you are running." I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Twin Mercury racing engines. Running dark. No transponder. You are moving product. And right now you are debating whether to put a bullet in me to keep your route clean." The older man cut the engines to a low idle, the silence of the ocean rushing back in. He stepped forward, pushing the gunman's arm down. "Who are you?" he asked, his accent thick, his eyes narrowing. "I am a man with a very specific problem and a lot of cash to solve it," I said, leaning back against the gunwale, trying to stop my shivering. "My name is Bill Carter. I own the salvage yards in Marathon. I know these waters better than anyone, and I know that dragging a body is messy. It brings the Coast Guard. It brings questions. You don't want questions. You want profit." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I have $50,000 in cash, untraceable. It is sitting in a floor safe in a private warehouse about 10 miles from here. It is yours. Tonight. All you have to do is drop me at the old cement docks in Key Largo." The younger man laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Why would we trust you? You are a witness." "I am not a witness." I shot back, my voice gaining strength. "I am a ghost." I looked at the horizon where my son had disappeared. The people who threw me off my boat think I am dead, and I need to stay that way. If you take me to the police, I have to file a report. I have to explain why I am alive. That draws heat. But if you drop me off in the dark, I disappear. You get 50 grand for a 20-minute detour, and I cease to exist. It is the perfect crime because there is no victim. The older man studied me for a long moment. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He saw the lack of fear. He was a businessman, and I was offering him the easiest payday of his life. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. "Get him a towel," he ordered the gunman, "and keep the gun on him. If he is lying, we feed him to the props." The boat roared back to life, the bow lifting as we accelerated across the black water. I sat on the stern, wrapped in a grease-stained blanket, watching the wake churn behind us. We moved like a phantom through the night, invisible to radar, invisible to the world. At 3 in the morning, the engines cut out. We drifted silently toward the rotting pilings of the old cement factory. The air was thick with the smell of mangroves and decaying seaweed. It was the smell of land, the smell of life. I guided them to the hidden dock behind my secondary storage unit, a place I hadn't visited in months. I led the older man inside, unlocked the floor safe, and handed him the bricks of cash. He counted them quickly, his eyes widening. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded, pocketed the money, and vanished back into the night. I stood alone on the cracked concrete, the silence of the abandoned dock wrapping around me. My son was probably sleeping soundly in my house, dreaming of his inheritance. My daughter-in-law was probably planning the funeral. They thought the ocean had swallowed their problem. They were wrong. William Carter was dead. But the man standing on the dock was something far more dangerous. I was a ghost with a vendetta, and I had just returned home. The heavy steel door of the warehouse clicked shut behind me, sealing out the humid Florida night and locking me in a tomb of silence and diesel fumes. This was the annex, a forgotten structure on the far edge of my salvage yard property that Brandon had deemed too old to renovate. To him, it was a liability. To me, it was a sanctuary. I didn't turn on the main lights. I navigated by memory through the maze of rusted engine blocks and piles of anchor chains until I reached the small office in the back. I flipped the switch in the cramped bathroom, and the fluorescent bulb flickered to life with a sickly yellow hum. I gripped the porcelain edges of the sink and stared into the cracked mirror. The reflection that stared back was a stranger. My eyes were bloodshot, sunken deep into dark hollows. My skin was peeling raw and red from the relentless salt and sun. My gray hair was matted with brine standing up in wild tufts. I looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave which wasn't far from the truth. William Carter, the respected business owner, the loving father, the pillar of the community, was gone. He died in the water. The man in the mirror was something else entirely. I opened the medicine cabinet and found a pair of heavy-duty shears and a razor. I didn't hesitate. I started cutting. Clumps of gray hair fell into the sink, mixing with the rust stains. I sheared it all off until my scalp was visible. Then I lathered my face with cold water and soap and scraped away the beard I had worn for 40 years. When I rinsed the blade for the last time, the transformation was complete. The face looking back at me was hard, angular, and terrifyingly blank. I looked like a convict. I looked like a predator. I looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. I put on a pair of dark coveralls and a baseball cap, pulling the brim low. I walked to the corner of the office and pulled up the loose floorboard that hid my emergency stash. Inside was a burner phone fully charged and waiting for a day I hoped would never come. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a husky, guarded voice answered. Rossi. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Sam, it is Bill. Don't say my name. Don't ask how. Just come to the annex, come alone, and make sure you are not followed. There was a heavy silence on the line, the kind where you can hear a person thinking. Samantha Rossi was a disgraced ex-cop who had lost her badge for being too honest in a crooked department. She was cynical, tough as nails, and the only person on earth I trusted. I will be there in 20, she said, and the line went dead. True to her word. 19 minutes later, the side door creaked open. Sam stepped into the shadows, her hand instinctively hovering near the waistband of her jeans, where I knew she kept her peace. She scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, until they landed on me. She didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She just let out a long, slow breath. You look like hell, Carter, she said, her voice steady but her eyes wide with disbelief. The news says you are shark bait. They are calling off the search tomorrow. I walked toward her, my boots echoing on the concrete. They tried, Sam. My own son pushed me. He left me to rot. Sam's expression hardened, her jaw tightening. I knew she had seen the worst of humanity during her time on the force, but patricide was a special kind of evil. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offering me one. I took it, my hand steady for the first time in 2 days. "So you are a ghost," she said, lighting hers. "What is the play, Bill? You want me to go to the cops?" "No," I said, the smoke filling my lungs sharp and grounding. "The cops require evidence. I don't just want justice, Sam. I want ruin. I want them to feel what I felt out there in the dark." Sam nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. She understood vengeance. She lived for it. "Name the price," she said. "I have plenty of cash," I replied. "But first, I need information. I need you to be my eyes and ears." I looked her dead in the eye, the cold rage in my chest burning hotter than ever. "My memorial service is scheduled for Sunday. I want to know exactly what happens. I want to know if they cry. I want to watch my own funeral." I stood behind the thick trunk of a massive banyan tree, the humidity of the Florida afternoon clinging to my skin like a second layer of sweat. From my vantage point on the hill, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the manicured lawn of the cemetery, where my empty casket was being lowered into the ground. It is a surreal and nauseating experience to watch your own funeral. It is an out-of-body nightmare that twists your gut and freezes your blood. There were flowers everywhere, mounds of white lilies and red roses, a fragrant and expensive display of mourning that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a year. A decent crowd had gathered. I saw my guys from the salvage yard, caps in hand, looking genuinely lost. I saw old fishing buddies and neighbors. They all had their heads bowed, respectful and sad. They believed the lie. They believed William Carter was lost at sea, a tragic accident that took a good man too soon. And then there was Brandon. My son. The murderer. He was standing right at the edge of the grave, his shoulders shaking with what looked like uncontrollable whoops. He wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, leaning on the pastor for support, looking for all the world like a broken child. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. If I hadn't looked into his dead, shark-like eyes as he pushed me overboard just days ago, I might have believed him myself. I might have felt pity for the poor boy who lost his father. But I knew the truth. Those weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. He was crying because he thought he had finally pulled it off. He was crying because he was finally the king of the castle, free from the old man's shadow. My eyes drifted to Megan. She stood slightly apart from Brandon, dressed in a sleek designer black dress that looked more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. She wore oversized dark sunglasses that hid her eyes, completely shielding her lack of tears from the public. She wasn't crying. Her posture was rigid, almost bored. She checked her watch twice in the span of 5 minutes, as if she had a dinner reservation she didn't want to miss. Then a man stepped out of the crowd and moved to her side. He wasn't one of my crew. He was wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my boat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He leaned in close to her, whispering something in her ear. It was an intimate gesture far too familiar for a stranger comforting a grieving daughter-in-law. And then I saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of Megan's mouth. She nodded slightly, her body relaxing toward him, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. I raised the compact binoculars Sam had given me, adjusting the focus wheel until the man's face filled my vision. My breath caught in my throat, turning into a growl. I knew him. I had paid him expensive retainers for 20 years. It was Arthur Wallace, my corporate attorney. The man who handled my contracts, my liability suits, and most importantly, my will. The man I trusted to protect my legacy was standing there, practically gloating, with my daughter-in-law over my empty grave. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a collision. Brandon was the muscle, the useful idiot with the gambling debt. But he wasn't smart enough to plan the legal takeover alone. Wallace. It had to be Wallace. He knew the loopholes. He knew the insurance clauses. He knew exactly how much I was worth down to the cent. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was a corporate coup, and they had just buried the only obstacle standing in their way. I sat in the suffocating darkness of the warehouse annex, the only light coming from the small green LED on the surveillance receiver Sam Rossi had set up. She had slipped into my house during the funeral reception, posing as a caterer, and planted high-sensitivity microphones in the living room, the kitchen, and most importantly, my private study. I adjusted the headphones, pressing them tight against my ears, waiting for the ghosts to speak. It didn't take long. Around 8 in the evening, the front door opened. There was no hesitation in their footsteps, no respectful silence for the house of the recently deceased. They stormed in like an invasion force. I heard the distinct click of Megan's heels on the hardwood floor, followed by Brandon's heavier, uneven gait. They didn't go to the kitchen for a drink. They didn't sit in the living room to reminisce. They went straight down the hall to my office. The sound of my heavy oak door being thrown open echoed through the headphones. Then came the destruction. It started with the sound of books being swept off shelves, thudding onto the floor in heavy piles. Then the crash of glass. My heart tightened. That was the display case where I kept my grandfather's compass and my service medals. They were trashing my history, looking for a payday. "Hurry up, Brandon." Megan hissed, her voice distorted slightly by the microphone but dripping with venom. "We need that cash tonight. The shark is not going to wait until probate clears." The shark. The name sent a jolt of recognition through me. That was the street name for Marcus Thorne, a loan shark who ran the underground gambling rings in Miami. So that was the debt. That was why they were so desperate. I listened as drawers were ripped out and dumped upside down. I heard papers tearing, the sound of my life's work being shredded in a frantic search for liquid assets. "It is behind the painting," Brandon said, his voice breathless and manic. "Help me get this thing down." I heard a struggle, a grunt of exertion, and then a loud, sickening crack. They had torn the large oil painting of the marina off the wall and thrown it to the floor. It was a gift from my late wife. I closed my eyes, my hands curling into fists so tight my knuckles turned white. They were desecrating everything. But I forced myself to keep listening. I needed to know how deep the rot went. I heard the electronic beeps of the wall safe keypad. 1, 2, 3, 4. Silence. Then the sharp negative buzz of an error code. I allowed myself a grim smile in the darkness. "Try it again, you idiot," Megan snapped. "You must have fat-fingered it. It is his birthday. He never changes it." I heard the beeps again, slower this time, deliberate. Beep, 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 beep. The long buzz of rejection followed instantly. I could hear Brandon's breathing accelerating, turning into panic. "I tried the anniversary," he muttered. "I tried his service number. Nothing works." The sound of a fist slamming against metal rang out, a dull, hollow thud. "Open it!" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "The code is wrong! The code is wrong!" The damn old man changed the code. The sound of the slap was electric, a sharp crack that cut through the static of the headphones and made me flinch in the darkness of the warehouse. It wasn't a lover's quarrel. It was the sound of a handler disciplining a disobedient animal. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, broken only by Brandon's pathetic, hitching breaths. I could visualize him perfectly holding his cheek, eyes wide with fear, cowering before the woman he thought was his partner. Then Megan spoke, her voice dropping to a register so low and cold, it made the hair on my arms stand up. "You are useless, Brandon. You are utterly, completely useless. We did the hard part. We got rid of the old man, and now you can't even open a simple wall safe." Brandon stammered, his voice thick with panic. "I tried every combination, Megan. I swear. He must have changed it recently. Maybe he knew. Maybe he suspected something." "Shut up," Megan hissed. "He didn't suspect anything. He was a senile old fool who trusted you. This is your fault. Everything is your fault. Do you think Marcus Thorne cares about a wrong combination? Do you think the shark accepts excuses? I leaned forward in my chair, pressing the headphones tighter. Marcus Thorne. The shark. I knew that name. He was a brutal loan shark operating out of Miami, a man who didn't send demand letters, he sent men with baseball bats and bolt cutters. But why was my son involved with a monster like Thorne? Brandon's next words answered the question that had been haunting me. It was your idea, Megan, he shouted, his voice cracking. You told me to leverage the company accounts. You said that crypto exchange was a sure thing. You said we would turn the 500,000 into 5 million in a month. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just gambling. It was worse. It was greed fueled by stupidity. My son had drained the company's operating capital to play the market on his wife's advice, and they had lost it all. $2 million. That was the number Brandon screamed next. They owed the shark $2 million and the payment was due in 48 hours. That was the motive. It wasn't just that they wanted my money. It was that they had already stolen it and lost it, and now they needed my life insurance and my liquid assets to cover the hole before they ended up in a ditch in the Everglades. I sat in the dark, realizing the depth of their betrayal. I wasn't just a father to them. I was a piggy bank they had smashed open because they were desperate. Megan's voice cut through the air again, sharp and decisive, regaining control. Stop crying. If we can't get the cash from the safe, we have to move to Plan B. We have the temporary power of attorney he signed. We control the assets. Brandon sniffled, sounding like a lost child. What do we do? Megan didn't hesitate. Her answer was a death sentence for my legacy. We liquidate, she ordered, her tone icy. Call the brokers in the morning. I want every boat sold. The tugs, the barges, even the legacy. Price them to move fast. I don't care if we get pennies on the dollar. I need cash in hand before the sun goes down tomorrow. Sell it all, Brandon. Burn it down if you have to. I need that money before the sharks come for us. The morning sun streamed into the office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the darkness of the conversation taking place. Brandon sat at my mahogany desk, the phone pressed so hard against his ear, his knuckles were white. Megan stood behind him, her arms crossed, tapping her foot, with a rhythm that sounded like a ticking bomb. Through my headphones in the warehouse, I heard every breath, every tremor in his voice. He was calling the insurance company. This was their Hail Mary. The safe was empty, and liquidating the boats would take too long to satisfy the sharks circling them. They needed the $10 million life insurance policy payout, and they needed it immediately. Yes, this is Brandon Carter, he said, trying to sound authoritative but sounding only frantic. I am reporting the death of William Carter, policy number 7793. He was lost at sea 3 days ago. I could hear the typing on the other end, a dry mechanical sound that seemed to stretch on for eternity. I am very sorry for your loss, Mr. Carter, the agent said, his voice professional and detached. I see the policy here. $10 million. The beneficiary is the estate. Brandon let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders sagging with relief. Great. How fast can you process the wire transfer? We have expenses, funeral arrangements, business continuity issues. The typing stopped abruptly. I am afraid it is not that simple, sir, the agent said. There is a specific rider attached to this policy. Your father added it 5 years ago. He called it the ghost clause. Brandon frowned, looking up at Megan, confusion clouding his panic. What does that mean? The agent cleared his throat. Mr. Carter was a former Marine and a salvage expert. He was very specific about the terms of accidental death at sea. The policy states that in the event of a disappearance where no physical body is recovered and positively identified, the payout is placed in an interest-bearing trust for a mandatory waiting period. Brandon gripped the edge of the desk. "How long is the waiting period?" 7 years, the agent replied calmly. 7 years, Brandon screamed, standing up so fast he knocked his chair over. "That is insane. He is dead. I saw him go under. I was there." "I understand that, sir," the agent replied, his voice unyielding. "But without a coroner's report and a body, we cannot rule out fraud or a staged disappearance. It is a standard procedure for high-value maritime policies made strict by your father's explicit request. There are no exceptions. If the body is found, the money is released immediately. If not, you will have access to the funds in 7 years. Have a good day, sir." The line went dead with a hollow click. The silence that filled the room was heavier than the ocean that had tried to swallow me. Brandon dropped the phone onto the desk as if it were burning his hand. He looked at Megan, his face draining of all color until he looked like a corpse himself. 7 years, he whispered, his voice trembling so hard the words barely formed. "We have to wait 7 years." Megan didn't scream this time. She just stared at him with eyes full of cold, terrifying hatred. The reality crashed down on them like a tidal wave. They had murdered me for a fortune they couldn't touch. They had killed the golden goose, and all they had to show for it was a mountain of debt and blood on their hands. Brandon sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. He realized in that moment that he had killed his father for $0. While Brandon lay on the floor of my office, paralyzed by the weight of a debt he could never pay and a murder he had committed for nothing, Megan did not offer him comfort. She didn't call a doctor. She checked her makeup in the hallway mirror, smoothed her black dress, and walked out the door. She left her husband drowning in his own panic and drove away in her Mercedes. But she wasn't alone. Sam Rossi was 2 cars behind her, a shadow in a beat-up sedan that no one would look at twice. Sam tracked her across the bridge, away from the quiet suburbs, and into the heart of the city's financial district. Megan pulled into the underground garage of the Pinnacle, the most exclusive residential tower in Miami. It was a place where privacy cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But Sam was a professional. She slipped past the gate before it closed and followed on foot. Back in the warehouse, I waited. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the cooling units. When Sam's text came through, it was just a location pin and a series of image files. I opened them on my tablet, the blue light illuminating the scars on my shaved head. The photos were grainy, taken with a long-range lens through a glass balcony railing, but they were sharp enough to stop my heart. Megan was standing on a penthouse terrace, a glass of wine in her hand. She wasn't grieving. She was laughing. And she wasn't alone. A man stepped into the frame, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. He buried his face in her neck, and she leaned back into him with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. It was Arthur Wallace, my lawyer, the man who had drafted the power of attorney documents, the man who had stood by my empty grave and whispered in her ear. I swiped to the next photo. They were kissing. It wasn't a new romance. It was practiced, comfortable, and deep. It was the kiss of 2 partners celebrating a victory. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Brandon was never the mastermind. He was just the weapon. Megan and Wallace had played him. They had fed his gambling addiction, encouraged his reckless investments, and then whispered the solution in his ear. Kill the old man. Get the insurance. Pay the debt. They knew Brandon was weak. They knew he would break. And when he did, when he went to prison for my murder, or got killed by the loan sharks, they would be there to pick up the pieces. They would inherit the company, the land, and the money, leaving my son to rot. Sam walked into the warehouse an hour later, tossing a manila envelope onto the desk. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look on her face said everything. She poured 2 shots of cheap whiskey and slid one toward me. I picked up the photos again, staring at the faces of the people who had orchestrated my death. I waited for the grief to come. I waited for the tears for my son, the pity for his stupidity. But nothing came. The pain that had been crushing my chest for days suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold Arctic void. The father who had tried to save his son was gone. In his place was the soldier who knew exactly what to do with enemy combatants. I swept the photos into a pile and looked at Sam. My eyes were dry. My hands were steady. "The time for mourning is over," I said, my voice flat and hard as steel. "Now we go to war." The silence in my old house had become a living thing, a suffocating presence that pressed against the windows and filled the hallways. Through the hidden microphones Sam had planted, I listened to the sound of a man unraveling. Brandon was alone in the living room, the clinking of a bottle against a glass, the only rhythm to his despair. He was drinking expensive scotch, my scotch trying to drown the reality of a $2 million debt and a $10 million insurance policy he couldn't touch. He was jumpy. Every creak of the floorboards made him freeze. Every shadow looked like a judgment. It was the perfect time to send the first greeting from the grave. I had planned this carefully. When Brandon threw my phone into the ocean, he didn't realize 2 things. First, that I always kept my GPS location services on for safety while working on the water. Second, that Sam Rossi knew the best salvage divers in the Keys. It had cost me $2,000 and a favor to get a diver down to that specific coordinate. The water was deep, but the current had pushed the device into a reef shelf. It was waterlogged, corroded, and dead to the world. But the shell was intact. The rugged, bright orange case was unmistakable. I had my tech guy swap the internals with a burner unit programmed with a single function. It was a prop, a piece of theater designed to shatter my son's sanity. At 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I watched on the monitor as Brandon jumped, spilling his drink. He waited terrified before creeping to the door. He looked through the peephole, saw nothing, and slowly opened it. There was no one there. Just a small, damp cardboard box sitting on the welcome mat. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a piece of fishing line. No return address. No stamps. Just his name scrawled in black marker. He brought it inside, his hands trembling. He placed it on the kitchen table, the same table where he had planned my murder. He cut the string with a steak knife. The box fell open. A pungent, salty smell filled the room immediately. The smell of the deep ocean of rotting seaweed and brine. Inside, nestled on a bed of wet sand I had scooped from the beach, lay the phone. The orange case was scratched and faded, crusted with salt crystals. Brandon stopped breathing. He backed away, his face draining of blood, until he looked like a ghost himself. It was impossible. He had watched that phone sink. He had thrown it into the abyss. It should be at the bottom of the ocean, buried under miles of water and silence. Yet here it was, sitting on his kitchen table, dripping seawater onto the wood. He couldn't look away. He circled the table, mesmerized by the impossibility of the object. He reached out his hand, shaking violently, and touched the screen. It was cold, ice cold, as if it had just been pulled from the depths. At that precise moment, I triggered the remote activation code from my laptop in the warehouse. The phone vibrated, a loud buzzing sound that made Brandon scream and stumble backward, knocking over a chair. The screen flickered to life, the backlight illuminating the dim kitchen with a ghostly blue glow. A single notification appeared on the lock screen, bright and clear. Brandon leaned in, his eyes wide with horror, reading the words I had typed. "The waves are cold down here, son." The psychological fracture that began with the wet phone on the kitchen table widened into a chasm within 24 hours. Brandon didn't sleep. He couldn't. I watched him on the monitors, pacing the length of the living room, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting to the corners where shadows pooled. He was terrified of the dark, but even more terrified of what he might see in it. My ghost had moved into his house and it was taking up all the space. The paranoia wasn't confined to the night. It followed him to the salvage yard like a stray dog. I had Sam park down the street so we could watch him through the telephoto lens. He walked out onto the docks, his gait uneven, twitchy. He stopped abruptly at the edge of the pier, staring out at the water. He started shouting, waving his arms at a buoy bobbing in the distance. "Get away from me!" he screamed, his voice carrying over the water. "I saw you die. Stay dead!" The yard crew stopped their work, welding torches sputtering out, cranes pausing in midair. They looked at their boss with a mixture of confusion and pity. There was nothing out there but seagulls and waves, but Brandon saw me rising from the depths to drag him down. He retreated to the office bathroom. Through the audio bug, I heard the water running, then a sudden violent crash. He had smashed the mirror. When he stumbled out, his knuckles were bloody, his face pale as ash. He grabbed his secretary by the shoulders, shaking her. "He was right there," he whispered frantically. "Behind me, in the glass. He was blue. He was drowning." The secretary pulled away, terrified, calling for security. Brandon was seeing his guilt reflected back at him, and it looked exactly like me. Megan's reaction was predictable. She didn't offer comfort. She offered disdain. She stormed into the office, finding him huddled under his desk. "Get up, you pathetic junkie," she hissed, kicking his leg. "Are you using again? Is that what this is? You are high and you are hallucinating." Brandon tried to explain about the phone, about the water, but she wouldn't listen. She looked at him with pure loathing. "There are no ghosts, Brandon. There is only the mess you are making. Pull yourself together before you blow the deal." Her contempt pushed him over the edge. He found a bottle of bourbon in his desk and drained half of it in an hour. By late afternoon, he was stumbling around the yard again, completely wasted. He grabbed the arm of a longtime mechanic, a man who had worked for me for 20 years. "Don't go out there, Jimmy," he slurred, swaying on his feet. "The water isn't safe. The sharks, they know. They have his eyes, my dad's eyes. They are waiting for the payment." The crew backed away, watching their boss disintegrate. Brandon fell to his knees on the concrete, laughing and crying, muttering about teeth and debts, while his empire crumbled around him. The sun beat down on the salvage yard, baking the asphalt and intensifying the smell of diesel and desperation. Brandon stood on the deck of the Titan, my flagship tug, wearing a suit that looked ridiculous against the industrial backdrop. He was sweating profusely, and it wasn't just the heat. Facing him were 3 men from a rival salvage outfit in Key West. They were serious buyers with deep pockets, the kind of men who could write a check for $2 million on the spot. This was Brandon's last stand. If he sold the fleet today, he could pay off Marcus Thorne and maybe, just maybe, survive the mess he had created. I watched from the annex monitor, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, waiting for the show to begin. "She is fully operational," Brandon said, his voice pitching too high. "Twin Cats recently overhauled. She can pull a freighter off a reef in a Force 5 gale. Turnkey ready." One of the buyers, a burly man with a beard, crossed his arms. "Start her up then. Let's hear those diesels purr." Brandon nodded eagerly and jumped into the wheelhouse. He turned the key. I held my breath. Silence. Then a pathetic, hollow clicking sound. Click, click, click. The massive Caterpillar engines didn't even turn over. Brandon frowned, twisting the key harder, as if force could fix a mechanical failure. "Come on," he muttered. He didn't know that at 3 a.m, I had slipped onto the boat like a shadow. I hadn't smashed anything. That would be too obvious. I had simply removed the main starter solenoids and replaced them with burnt-out ones from the scrap pile. It was a subtle, surgical sabotage. The buyers exchanged skeptical looks. "Battery dead?" the bearded man asked. "No, they are brand new," Brandon stammered. He scrambled to the engine room hatch. "Let's look at the Iron Mule instead. That one is a beast." He led them down the dock to the barge tug. This time the engine roared to life, belching a cloud of black smoke. Brandon smiled, relief washing over his face. See, she runs like a dream. But 10 seconds later, a piercing alarm cut through the air. The high water bilge alarm. The buyers looked down into the open hatch. Water was spraying into the engine compartment with the force of a fire hose. I had loosened the clamps on the raw water cooling intake just enough so that the pressure of the running engine would blow the hose off. That was it. The buyers didn't wait for an explanation. "This is a junkyard, Carter," the bearded man spat. "You are wasting my time. These tubs are sinking at the dock." They turned and walked away, their boots heavy on the wood, leaving my son standing alone in a cloud of exhaust and failure. He watched them get into their trucks and drive off, taking his salvation with them. His phone began to ring in his pocket. He didn't answer it. He knew who it was. The sun was setting, and the shark was hungry. Brandon had no money, no assets he could sell, and no way out. He kicked the railing of the boat, screaming in frustration, while I sat in the dark watching my empire rust, satisfied that if I couldn't run it, neither would he. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the black SUV rolled up the driveway of my former home. I watched on the monitor in the warehouse the grainy night vision feed, turning the world into shades of green and black. Brandon was pacing in the living room, nursing a bottle of vodka, when the front door didn't just open. It exploded inward. The wood frame splintered with a violence that made me flinch even miles away. 3 men stepped inside. They weren't wearing masks. They didn't need to. In Miami, everyone knew who worked for Marcus Thorne. They were huge, dressed in cheap suits that strained against their bulk, moving with the terrifying casualness of men who hurt people for a living. Brandon didn't even try to fight. He scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp, whimpering like a kicked dog. "Please," he begged, his hands raised in a pathetic shield. "I just need a few more days. The boats. I am selling the boats." The leader, a man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo, didn't say a word. He just nodded to the man on his left. The enforcer stepped forward, grabbed Brandon by the collar of his expensive shirt, and threw him onto the coffee table. Glass shattered. Brandon screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that cut through the audio feed. Then came the bat. It was a short metal club, efficient and brutal. The enforcer swung at once, a precise, calculated blow to Brandon's right forearm. The sound of the bone snapping was loud, wet, and sickening. Brandon howled, curling into a ball, clutching his broken arm to his chest. The leader leaned down, grabbing a handful of Brandon's hair and yanking his head back. "That was the interest payment." He said, his voice low and calm. "You have 48 hours for the principal. Or next time, we don't break the arm. We take it with us." They turned and walked out, leaving my son writhing in a pool of glass and spilled alcohol. I watched, waiting for Megan to rush in, waiting for her to call 911, waiting for any sign of humanity. But when she appeared at the top of the stairs, she wasn't holding a phone. She was holding a glass of wine. She walked down the stairs, slowly stepping over the shattered remains of the lamp. She looked at Brandon, who was sobbing, begging her to help him to call an ambulance. She didn't kneel beside him. She didn't offer comfort. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, like she was looking at a stain on her carpet. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes cold and dead. Then she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number. I knew who was on the other end before she even spoke. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady. "The shark just left. They broke his arm. He is done." She listened for a moment, watching her husband bleed on the floor. "No," she continued. "He is useless to us now. He can't sell the boats. He can't get the insurance. He is just a liability. It is time for Plan B." I leaned closer to the speaker, my heart pounding. Plan B. What else could they possibly do to him? Megan's next words chilled me to the bone. "Start the paper trail," she ordered. We frame him for embezzlement. We say he stole the operating capital to fund his gambling addiction. We hand him over to the feds. Once he is in prison, I get power of attorney by default. We take the company, Arthur, and we leave him to rot. She hung up the phone and took another sip of wine, stepping carefully around Brandon's thrashing legs to go into the kitchen for a refill. My son lay broken on the floor, destroyed by the monsters he had invited into our lives, while his wife planned to bury him alive. The pain in his right arm was a constant throbbing reminder of his failure. Brandon sat on the edge of the guest bed, the only place Megan would allow him to stay now that he was damaged goods. His cast was heavy, but the weight of the silence in the house was heavier. Downstairs, he could hear the faint murmur of Megan's voice on the phone. She was talking to Wallace. He didn't need to hear the words to know they were finalizing the plans to lock him away. They were going to feed him to the system, just like he had fed his father to the ocean. He held his phone in his left hand, scrolling aimlessly through his contacts, looking for a miracle that didn't exist. No one was going to lend him $2 million. He was a dead man walking. Then a notification banner slid down the top of his screen. It wasn't a text from the loan sharks. It wasn't a threat. It was an email from a sender he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Acquisition proposal regarding Carter Marine Salvage." Brandon frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. He tapped it open. The email was brief, professional, and to the point. It claimed to be from a private equity firm called Horizon Deep Ventures. They specialized in distressed maritime assets and were looking to acquire a controlling stake in the company immediately. They offered a buyout of his personal shares for a lump sum of $3 million. Brandon stopped breathing. He read the number again. $3 million. He did the math in his head instantly. $2 million to pay off Marcus Thorne and save his life. $1 million to disappear to Costa Rica or Thailand, far away from Megan Wallace and the ghost of his father. It was a lifeline thrown into the middle of a storm. He sat up, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his arm. Why would anyone want to buy the company now? It didn't matter. Maybe they wanted the permits. Maybe they wanted the waterfront land. He didn't care. He just needed the money. He looked at the door, paranoid that Megan might burst in and snatch the phone away. If she knew about this, she would take the deal for herself. She would sell the company, take the $3 million, and still send him to prison. This had to be his secret. This was his chance to turn the tables. He could sell the company out from under her, pay his debts, and vanish before she even realized she was the queen of nothing. A vindictive smile touched his lips. He typed a reply with his shaking thumb. I am interested, but this must happen fast, and it must be strictly confidential. No other parties are to be involved. The response came back within 30 seconds. It was automated, efficient. We understand the urgency. Proof of funds is attached. We are prepared to close within 24 hours. A digital statement appeared on the screen showing a Swiss bank account with a balance that made Brandon dizzy. It was real. He wasn't going to die. He wasn't going to jail. He was going to survive. He quickly deleted the email thread from his inbox and cleared his trash folder. He lay back on the bed, clutching the phone to his chest, listening to his wife downstairs, plotting a future that he had just canceled. He had no idea that the mysterious investor on the other end of the line wasn't a venture capitalist in a high-rise. It was a bald man in a grease-stained jumpsuit sitting in a rusted warehouse less than a mile away. The email I sent to Brandon was drafted with the cold precision of a corporate executioner. I didn't ask nicely. I demanded, "Mr. Carter," I typed, the blue light of the laptop illuminating the scars on my scalp. "Horizon Deep Ventures is prepared to wire the funds immediately. However, our risk assessment team has flagged a critical issue regarding the ownership chain. The disappearance of the founder, William Carter, presents a liability we are not willing to inherit. Before we close, you must provide a notarized affidavit detailing the circumstances of his absence and proof of your absolute uncontested authority to liquidate these assets. We need to know there will be no legal resurrection of the previous owner. Meet our representative at the secure storage facility near the executive airport at 10 p.m. Come alone. Bring the documents. Do not be late. I hit send and leaned back in the rusted chair, the metal groaning under my weight. It was the perfect bait. I was asking him to formalize his lie. I was asking him to put his crime on paper and hand it to a stranger in exchange for a suitcase of money. If he signed that affidavit, he wasn't just selling the company. He was signing a confession to fraud and perjury. He would be incriminating himself in a way that no lawyer, not even Wallace, could fix. I switched the monitor view to the camera hidden in Brandon's bedroom. He read the email, his eyes darting back and forth across the screen. I saw the moment the desperation won over the fear. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. The loan sharks had given him 48 hours, and the clock was ticking down. He went to his closet and pulled out a portable file box he had stolen from my office. He dug through the papers with his good hand, his broken arm in the cast making him clumsy and slow. He found the temporary power of attorney I had signed before the fishing trip. He took a pen, his hand shaking so badly he had to steady it against the desk, and began to alter the document. He changed the dates. He forged my initials next to a clause that granted him indefinite executive power. It was a sloppy forgery, an act of sheer panic, but he was betting that a shady private equity firm wouldn't look too closely if the deal was profitable enough. He stuffed the forged papers into a leather portfolio. He checked the hallway, ensuring Megan was still downstairs, distracted by her own schemes. He grabbed his car keys and crept out the back door, moving like a thief in his own home. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, his eyes sunken and wild. He looked like a man who was being hunted by ghosts, which in a way he was. I watched him get into his car and back out of the driveway without turning on his headlights. I waited until he was down the street before I grabbed my own keys. I had to get to the meeting point before he did. I had to set the stage. I drove to the industrial park near the airport, a desolate grid of corrugated metal and barbed wire. The unit I had rented was at the end of a dead-end row, isolated and soundproof. I pulled my truck around the back, hidden from view. I checked my earpiece. Sam Rossi was already inside, dressed in a severe gray suit, wearing glasses with a built-in camera. She looked every inch the ruthless corporate closer. I settled into the surveillance van parked 50 yards away, watching the feed from inside the unit. At exactly 9:58 p.m., Brandon's headlights swept across the metal door. He parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a long moment. I could see him hyperventilating, gripping the steering wheel with his good hand. He was terrified of the loan sharks, terrified of Megan, and terrified of the night. But the greed, the promise of $3 million was stronger than the fear. He grabbed the portfolio, stepped out into the humid night air, and walked toward the door where his judgment awaited. I watched on the grainy black and white monitor as my son walked into the trap. The storage unit was set up like a makeshift interrogation room, though to his desperate eyes, it probably looked like a clandestine business meeting. There was a single metal table, 2 chairs, and a harsh overhead light that buzzed like an angry insect. Sam sat on one side, her posture rigid, her face obscured by the glare on her glasses. She looked like a shark in a tailored suit. Brandon stumbled in, clutching the leather portfolio to his chest like a shield. He looked worse than I had ever seen him. His cast was dirty, his shirt stained with sweat, and his eyes darted around the room, expecting monsters in every shadow. He sat down, wincing as his broken arm bumped the metal table. "I have the papers," he said, his voice raspy and thin. He slid the forged documents across the surface. Sam didn't even look at them. She stared at him, silence stretching, until it became a physical weight in the small room. "Mr. Carter," she finally said, her voice cool and detached. "My investors are not interested in paperwork that can be contested in court. We are buying a company that belonged to a man who is currently listed as missing. Missing men have a habit of coming back. If your father returns next week or next year, this sale is void, and we lose our capital. We cannot take that risk. Brandon slammed his good hand on the table, the sound echoing through my speakers. "He is not coming back," he shouted, the desperation cracking his voice. "I told you I have full authority." Sam leaned forward, interlacing her fingers calmly. Authority on paper is one thing. Certainty is another. Unless you can provide absolute proof that William Carter is permanently out of the equation, we walk away right now. She made a show of reaching for her briefcase, ready to leave. Panic seized Brandon. He saw the $3 million walking out the door. He saw the loan sharks coming back to break his other arm, or worse. He saw his life ending in a ditch. The dam broke. "Wait," he screamed, scrambling up from his chair. "You don't understand. You don't have to worry about him coming back." He lowered his voice, leaning in, his eyes wide and manic, fueled by sleepless nights and the vodka he had downed before driving over. "He is dead. Okay. He is gone." Sam paused, her hand on the latch of her case. "How can you be sure, Mr. Carter? The ocean is a big place." Brandon let out a short, hysterical laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Because I put him there. I pushed him off the boat myself 10 miles out. I watched him go under. I left him to the sharks. There is no body. There is no survivor. He is never coming back because I made sure of it." The silence that followed was absolute. Brandon stood there panting, realizing what he had just said, but too desperate to care. He had sold his soul for the deal. Sam slowly sat back down. She adjusted her glasses, her finger tapping the side of the frame where the microcamera was recording every pixel of his confession. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Carter," she said, sliding a heavy metal briefcase across the table. That was exactly the assurance we needed. In the surveillance van, I exhaled for the first time in minutes. I had him. I had the confession. I had the weapon that would destroy him. But the night wasn't over. We still had to let him think he had won. While Brandon was confessing his sins in a dusty warehouse, believing he was buying his freedom, his wife was executing her own endgame 50 miles away. Megan sat in the glass-walled conference room of Wallace's high-rise law firm, looking out over the glittering Miami skyline. She wasn't nervous. She was exhilarated. On the polished table in front of her lay a stack of documents that would erase William Carter's legacy forever. Arthur Wallace stood beside her, guiding her hand, not with affection, but with the cold precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. They were forging my signature. They had brought in a specialist, a man named Davila, who could replicate a signature with terrifying accuracy. He worked from old contracts I had signed years ago, tracing the loops of my W and the sharp strike of my C until he could reproduce them perfectly. He signed deed after deed, transferring the land, the warehouse, the fleet, and the operating accounts directly into a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company controlled solely by Megan. They weren't just stealing the business. They were liquidating it, turning 40 years of hard work into digital currency that could be washed through offshore accounts and disappear before anyone realized a crime had been committed. "Excellent," Wallace murmured, picking up the transfer of ownership for the prime waterfront property. "With this, we can close the deal with the Zenith Group tomorrow morning. They are wiring $12 million at 9 a.m. Once the funds clear, we are on a plane to Zurich." Megan smiled, sipping her champagne. "And Brandon? What about him?" Wallace shrugged dismissively. "Let the loan sharks have him. Or the police. He is a loose end, Megan. Loose ends get cut." She nodded without hesitation. "I will report him missing in the morning. I will say he took the company funds and ran. It is the perfect cover. I watched all of this unfold not through a camera, but through the data stream on my laptop. I had a friend inside the bank, a woman named Elena, whom I had helped out of a bad mortgage years ago. She had flagged the accounts the moment the transfer requests started coming in. My phone pinged with a secure message from her. Bill, they just initiated the transfer protocols. The final authorization is scheduled for tomorrow morning when the markets open. If that money moves, it is gone forever. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my tired eyes. They were fast, faster than I anticipated. They were going to strip the carcass clean before the body was even cold. I had planned to let them sweat, to let them turn on each other slowly, but they had accelerated the timeline. If I waited for the police or the courts, it would be too late. The money would be in Switzerland, and they would be untouchable. I had to stop the transaction at the source. I typed a quick reply to Elena. Hold the transfer, flag it for fraud review. Use my old security code, the one only I know. Then I stood up, grabbing my jacket. It was time to step out of the shadows. The legal game was over. Now it was personal. Brandon walked out of that storage unit, walking on air, clutching the aluminum briefcase to his chest like a newborn baby. Inside sat what he believed was a down payment of $500,000 in cash, with the rest to be wired offshore. He didn't check the bundles deep enough. He saw the face of Benjamin Franklin on the top bills, and that was enough for his greedy, desperate mind. He didn't know that below the first layer of real currency lay stacks of cut newspaper and prop money I had ordered online. It was a stage prop for a man living in a fantasy world, but for tonight it was his ticket to freedom. He drove home, driving 20 miles over the limit, his mind already in Costa Rica. He wasn't thinking about his father rotting at the bottom of the ocean, or the morality of his actions. He wasn't thinking about the wife he was about to abandon. He was thinking about tequila and beaches and surviving. He burst into the house, running up the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the throbbing pain in his broken arm. He went straight to the master bedroom and threw a duffel bag onto the bed. He started sweeping clothes into it indiscriminately, watches, jewelry, anything small and valuable he could pawn when he landed. He shoved the heavy briefcase under the bed, kicking it deep into the shadows. He needed to be gone before Megan came back from her meeting with Wallace. He was going to leave her to face the loan sharks alone. It was poetic justice in his twisted mind. She had pushed him to kill me so he would leave her to die. But he wasn't fast enough. The bedroom door creaked open. Megan stood there, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. She looked at the open duffel bag. She looked at his frantic, sweating face. Then her eyes drifted to the corner of the bed, where the metallic edge of the briefcase was sticking out. "What are you doing, Brandon?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "I am leaving Megan," he spat back, zipping up the bag with his good hand. "I am done with you. I am done with the sharks. I found a way out." She walked over and pulled the briefcase out. She popped the latches. The sight of the cash bundles made her eyes widen for a fraction of a second. Then they narrowed. She didn't scream. She didn't fight for her share. She realized instantly that he was cutting her out. She closed the case and stepped back. "You stole this, didn't you? From the operating accounts. Before I could transfer them." Brandon laughed a manic sound. "It is my money. My company. I sold my shares. You get nothing." Megan didn't argue. She simply turned and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Brandon went back to packing, thinking he had won the argument. He didn't hear her in the hallway. I did. Through the surveillance feed, I heard her dial 3 digits. 911. Her voice transformed instantly into a trembling mask of terror. "Please help me," she sobbed into the phone. "It is my husband. He is having a psychotic break. He has a gun. He stole money from our company, and he says he is going to kill everyone. Please hurry." The sirens cut through the humid night air, a rising wail that signaled the end of Brandon's short-lived fantasy of escape. He froze in the bedroom, looking from the window to his wife. Megan stood by the door, her face a mask of triumphant cruelty. She didn't have to say a word. The approaching lights, flashing red and blue against the palm trees outside, said it all. She had sold him out. Brandon didn't waste time arguing. He grabbed the heavy duffel bag, abandoning the fake cash under the bed, and bolted through the French doors onto the second-floor balcony. He vaulted over the railing, landing hard on the manicured lawn, ignoring the jar to his broken arm. He ran toward the water, toward the only exit he had left. I watched him from the shadows of the neighboring property, a ghost, witnessing the destruction of his own house. Brandon was heading for the dock. He was heading for the legacy. It was the only move he could make. The roads would be blocked within minutes. His only hope was to reach international waters, to disappear into the Caribbean, just like he had tried to make me disappear. He sprinted down the long wooden pier, his footsteps heavy and frantic on the planks. He threw the bag onto the deck and scrambled aboard, slipping on the dew-slicked fiberglass. He didn't bother untying the lines. He planned to tear the cleats right out of the dock if he had to. He rushed up the ladder to the flybridge, his hands fumbling blindly under the console mat for the spare key. He found it. He jammed it into the ignition and turned it. The twin Caterpillar diesels roared to life instantly, a deep, powerful thrum that vibrated through the hull. It was the sound of power, the sound of freedom. Brandon grabbed the stainless steel throttles and slammed them forward, bracing himself for the surge of acceleration that would carry him away from the police, away from Megan, away from his crimes. The engines screamed, the RPM gauge spiking into the red zone. The exhaust belched a thick cloud of black smoke into the night sky. The noise was deafening, a mechanical roar that drowned out the sirens, but the boat didn't move. It didn't lurch forward. It didn't cut through the water. It just sat there, vibrating violently, the engines howling in futile style. Brandon stared at the controls in wild confusion. He pulled the throttles back to neutral, then slammed them into reverse, hoping to back out. The engines revved again, screaming in protest, but the water behind the boat remained disturbingly calm. There was no wash, no thrust, no movement. He didn't know that at 2 a.m, I had put on my dive gear and slipped into the black water of the canal. I hadn't sabotaged the engines. I had done something far more permanent. I had removed the propellers. The massive bronze blades were currently sitting at the bottom of the channel, buried under 3 feet of mud. Brandon was sitting in a multi-million-dollar getaway vehicle that had no wheels. He was revving the engine of a floating prison cell. He screamed in pure, unadulterated frustration, slamming his good fist against the instrument panel, realizing too late that his father's boat would not be his salvation. It would be the place where he was captured. The sirens were screaming now, a cacophony of wailing noise that seemed to be closing in from every direction. Brandon stood frozen on the deck of the boat, staring down at the white bricks scattered across the fiberglass. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of arrest. He picked up one of the packages, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He ripped the corner of the plastic with his teeth, tasting the white powder that spilled out. He spat it out, coughing, but the damage was done. In his mind, it was pure cocaine. He was standing on 20 kilos of a life sentence. He looked at the cooler again, the same brand, the same size as the one he had watched me float away on. It was a message from the grave delivered with surgical cruelty. He scrambled backward, scrambling away from the drugs, as if they were radioactive. He looked toward the parking lot, where the flashing blue and red lights were already painting the palm trees in a chaotic strobe. He thought they were coming for the money he stole from the safe. He thought this was about embezzlement, about corporate theft, about a domestic dispute gone wrong. He didn't understand the scale of the trap I had built for him. He didn't know that I hadn't just called the local police about a disturbance. I had called the Coast Guard and the Drug Enforcement Administration. I had tipped them off about a vessel attempting to run a blockade with a major shipment of narcotics. I watched from the shadows, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of satisfaction. I saw the first cruiser skid to a halt at the edge of the pier. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, taking cover behind their doors. A megaphone crackled to life, the voice distorted and booming across the water. "This is the Sheriff's Department. Exit the vessel with your hands in the air. We have you surrounded. Brandon looked at the water, then back at the drugs. He realized in that moment that he couldn't explain this away. He couldn't blame Megan. He couldn't hire a lawyer to fix this. He was caught on a boat that wouldn't move, with a duffel bag full of stolen goods and a cooler full of what looked like the cartel's inventory. He wasn't just a son who killed his father anymore. He was the perfect suspect for a crime he didn't even know he was committing. The trap had snapped shut, and he was the rat caught inside. Brandon looked at the approaching Coast Guard cutter and made the only decision a coward could make. He abandoned ship. He didn't even grab the duffel bag full of clothes and jewelry. He just vaulted over the side rail and splashed into the dark canal water. I watched him surface, gasping for air, his plaster cast heavy and waterlogged, dragging him down like an anchor. He kicked frantically with his good arm and legs, looking like a wounded animal scuttling for the safety of the mangroves. The spotlight from the police helicopter swept the deck of the Legacy, illuminating the white bricks of fake cocaine just seconds after his head disappeared beneath the surface of the black water. He had timed it perfectly. Or rather, I had timed it perfectly for him. The authorities boarded the boat, guns drawn, focused on the massive drug seizure sitting on the deck. They weren't looking for a swimmer in the reeds, not yet. They assumed the captain was hiding below deck, or had fled before they arrived. This gave Brandon the narrow window he needed. He dragged himself onto the muddy bank of the neighboring property, shivering and covered in slime. He crawled into the dense foliage, pressing himself into the dirt as the chaos unfolded behind him. He thought he was the luckiest man alive. He thought he had slipped the noose. He didn't understand that I had left the back door open on purpose. Arresting him now would be too easy. It would be too clean. I needed him desperate. I needed him angry. I needed him to have a target, and I wanted that target to be his wife. He lay there for an hour until the sirens faded into the distance. Then he began to move. He was a fugitive now, a wanted man. His face would be on the news by morning, linked to a massive narcotics bust. He had no money, no car, and a broken arm. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was a miracle it still worked, protected by its waterproof casing. He dialed the one number he thought could save him. Arthur Wallace, the man who had helped steal my company. The man who was currently sleeping with his wife. I intercepted the call through the clone signal I had set up weeks ago. Brandon was whispering, his voice trembling with hysteria. "Arthur, you have to help me. I am in trouble. The police are at the boat. There were drugs, Arthur. Someone set me up. I need money. I need a place to hide. Send a car to the old airstrip. I will meet you there." Wallace didn't sound surprised. He didn't sound worried. He sounded bored. He sounded like a man who was already counting his millions in a Swiss villa. "Brandon," he said, his voice smooth and lethal. "You are a liability. You botched the sale. You brought heat on the operation. And quite frankly, you are becoming tedious. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. Brandon stared at the phone, the screen illuminating his face in the darkness. The realization hit him harder than the bat that broke his arm. He wasn't a partner. He was the fall guy. And he was all alone. The mud of the mangrove swamp was thick and foul-smelling, clinging to Brandon's clothes like a second skin. He huddled under the roots of a massive banyan tree, shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from the shock of his world disintegrating. He was a fugitive, a drug trafficker, a pariah. And while he was rotting in the dirt, the people who had engineered his destruction were likely toasting to their success. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a sudden vibration that made him jump. He stared at it, debating whether to throw it into the water and sever his last tie to civilization. But curiosity, that fatal flaw, pulled him in. He wiped the screen with a muddy thumb. It was a message from an unknown number. No words of comfort. No offers of help. Just a location. The Grand Hotel. The Royal Suite. Tonight. Below the text was a video file. Brandon pressed play. The tiny screen illuminated his face with a harsh blue light. The footage was shaky, obviously taken from a hidden camera or a cell phone across a room, but the audio was crystal clear. It showed the interior of a luxury suite, the kind Brandon used to rent before the money ran out. Megan was there, looking radiant in a white dress, holding a flute of champagne. Wallace was sitting on the sofa, his tie loosened, laughing. I turned the volume up so Brandon could hear every word. I bet he is still running, Wallace chuckled. Do you think he knows we cut the deal an hour ago? Megan swirled her wine, her lips curling into a cruel smile. Brandon doesn't know anything. He is a useful idiot, Arthur. He always has been. He did the dirty work and now he gets to be the scapegoat. It is almost tragic how stupid he is. The video ended. The screen went black, reflecting Brandon's own hollowed-out eyes. Something inside him finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a quiet, terrifying shift. The fear evaporated, replacing itself with a cold, concentrated hatred. They were laughing at him. They were spending his inheritance. They were calling him an idiot while he bled in the mud. He stood up, ignoring the screaming pain in his broken arm. He wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. He knew exactly where to go. Not to the bank, not to the police, but to a place he hadn't visited since he was a troubled teenager. He stumbled through the brush, making his way to the old stone seawall at the edge of the property line. It was a place where he used to hide from me when he had done something wrong. He fell to his knees, clawing at the loose stones near the base. He dug frantically, tearing his fingernails until he felt the cold, hard edge of a metal box. He pulled it out. It was a rusted tackle box, airtight, and sealed with duct tape. He ripped the tape off his breath, coming in ragged gasps. Inside, wrapped in an oil-stained rag, lay a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver. He had stolen it from a pawn shop 15 years ago, a secret piece of power he had kept for a day he hoped would never come. He unwrapped the cloth. The gun was heavy, cold, and lethal. He checked the cylinder. 5 rounds. 5 bullets for 2 traitors. He snapped the cylinder shut, the metallic click echoing in the silence of the swamp. He wiped the mud from his face, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the city lights. He had a destination now. He had a purpose. And he had the means to settle the debt once and for all. The grand ballroom of the hotel was a kaleidoscope of light and arrogance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, like frozen explosions refracting the glow of 1,000 candles onto the polished marble floor. It was a scene of obscene wealth and self-congratulation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of polite conversation. Waiters in white jackets moved silently through the crowd, offering trays of caviar and champagne to the city's elite. At the center of this golden orbit stood the queen of the hour. Megan looked stunning in a floor-length gown of shimmering silver silk, a dress that likely cost more than the annual salary of my best deckhand. She threw her head back, laughing at something a senator was whispering in her ear, her neck exposed and glittering with a diamond necklace that had once belonged to my mother. Beside her, Arthur Wallace held court with a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked the part of the distinguished elder statesman, radiating confidence and success. He clapped men on the back and kissed the hands of their wives, acting the role of the benevolent patriarch. To the room, they were the tragic survivors of a family misfortune, brave souls who had weathered the storm of my death and the scandal of my son's alleged embezzlement. They were playing the victims and the victors simultaneously, and the crowd was eating it up. They had no idea that their entire celebration was a stage play, and the director was sitting just outside the front door. I watched it all from the climate-controlled silence of a stretched Mercedes limousine parked across the street in the shadows of the valet stand. The tinted windows turned the world into a dark, cinematic noir. I looked at my reflection in the glass partition. The wild-eyed castaway with the sun-bleached beard was gone. In his place sat a man who looked like he owned the bank that owned the hotel. I was wearing a bespoke tuxedo that fit like armor, my shaved head shining under the streetlights, my face hard and impassive. I looked like a shark that had learned to walk on land. On the high-definition screen embedded in the leather console in front of me, the live feed from the ballroom played out in crisp detail. I had paid a heavy price to a hacker collective Sam knew to compromise the hotel's security system. I had eyes on every exit, every hallway, and every smile. I zoomed in on Megan's face. I saw the triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought Brandon was running for his life in a swamp, and I was fish food. She thought she was untouchable. I reached for the comms unit in my ear, pressing the button. Sam was positioned in the hotel control room, posing as the night manager, a role she played with terrifying authority. Her voice came back clear and steady. All assets are in place, Bill. Sets are in fornuta. The exits are secured. The police scanner is quiet for now. We are green across the board. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air of the limo fill my lungs. This was it. The moment the trap snapped shut. The moment the dead man walked back into the room. I looked at the screen one last time, watching Wallace raise his glass for a toast. "Let's not keep them waiting," I said, my voice low and final. "Start the show." The string quartet was playing a soft, uplifting melody, a delicate layer of sound that floated over the chatter of the city's elite. Waiters glided between tables, pouring vintage champagne, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted duck. It was the perfect picture of high society, untouchable and safe. Then the heavy double doors of the ballroom burst open with a crash that sounded like a gunshot. The music died, instantly strangled by the sudden violence. The room went silent, so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Every head turned toward the entrance. Standing there, framed by the darkness of the hallway, was a creature that belonged in a nightmare, not a gala. It was Brandon. But it wasn't the Brandon they knew. He was dripping wet, his clothes torn and caked with the thick black mud of the mangroves. One shoe was missing. His right arm was encased in a filthy plaster cast that was cracking apart, and his face was a mask of scratches and wild, desperate rage. He looked like he had crawled out of a grave. He took a step forward, leaving a smear of slime on the pristine white marble floor. A woman near the entrance screamed a high, piercing sound that shattered the paralysis. Brandon didn't look at her. He didn't look at the security guards who were hesitating, uncertain how to handle a man who looked like a monster. His eyes were locked on one person. He raised his good hand. The rusty metal of the revolver caught the light of the chandeliers, a dull, lethal glint that sent a wave of panic through the room. People scrambled back, overturning tables and dropping glasses, the sound of breaking crystal mixing with the screams. Brandon walked through the chaos like a man in a trance. He marched straight toward the head table where his wife stood frozen in her silver gown. He stopped 10 feet away, pointing the shaking barrel of the gun directly at her chest. "Look at you!" He rasped, his voice raw and broken. "Look at you standing there like a queen, while I am out there in the mud, while I am being hunted like a dog." Megan's face went pale, her perfect composure cracking for the first time. She took a step back, her hands raising instinctively. "Brandon, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are not well. Put the gun down." "Liar," he screamed, the word tearing from his throat. "You did this. You planned it all. You told me there was no other way. You told me we had to do it." He stepped closer, the gun waving erratically. "I killed him for you, Megan. I pushed my own father into the ocean because you said we needed the money. You said we would be free. And now you leave me to rot. You set me up." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The guests gasped, the horror of the confession sinking in. They weren't just witnessing a breakdown, they were witnessing a murder confession. Wallace had already backed away, disappearing into the crowd, like the coward he was, leaving Megan alone in the spotlight. She looked around, seeing the judgment in the eyes of her peers. She knew she had to salvage the narrative immediately. Her face hardened, the fear replaced by a cold survival instinct. "You are insane, Brandon," she shouted, her voice gaining strength. "You are a drug addict and a thief. I never told you to do anything. You did this all by yourself. You are sick and you are hallucinating. Do not drag me into your madness." The chaos in the ballroom reached a fever pitch, with screams echoing off the marble walls and guests scrambling over overturned chairs to escape the madman with the gun. Brandon stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and unfocused as he screamed his accusations at his wife. Megan was backing away, her hands raised, her face a mask of terror and calculation, trying to find the words to spin this disaster. The tension was a physical weight, a taut wire ready to snap. And then the world simply ended. In a single synchronized heartbeat, the crystal chandeliers overhead flickered once and died, plunging the massive hall into absolute suffocating darkness. The music cut out instantly. The screaming stopped, replaced by a collective gasp of shock. The sudden sensory deprivation was disorienting. For a terrifying moment, the only sounds were the whimpering of huddled guests and the heavy, wet breathing of the man holding the revolver. Brandon froze, his finger hovering over the trigger, the darkness stripping away his visual target. He spun around, trying to pierce the gloom, his paranoia spiking. He thought it was a police raid. He thought it was the end. Then a low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of heavy electronics powering up. A beam of pure white light sliced through the blackness from the projector booth, hitting the massive cinema screen behind the main stage. The guests shielded their eyes, squinting against the sudden harsh glare. They expected a corporate logo. They expected a tribute video to the late William Carter, set to mournful piano music to salvage the evening. What they got was the vibrant turquoise blue of the open Atlantic. The footage was high definition, crisp and steady, shot from a high angle. It was drone footage. The camera panned over the sparkling waves, capturing the beauty of the Florida coast, likely intended for a travel vlog or a real estate promo. But the lens had found something else. It zoomed in, tracking a white fishing boat bobbing in the swell. The name on the stern was clearly visible in bold black letters. The Legacy. A ripple of recognition went through the crowd. The camera descended, hovering just 100 feet above the deck. The resolution was terrifyingly sharp. On the screen, two figures were locked in a violent struggle near the stern. Everyone in the room recognized the silver hair and the broad shoulders of William Carter. And everyone recognized the man shoving him. It was Brandon. The angle was perfect. It showed the rage on his face, the contorted features of a son betraying his father. It showed the violent shove. It showed the older man stumbling backward, losing his footing and hitting the water with a splash that seemed to echo in the silent ballroom. The drone hovered, watching as the boat turned away, the wake cutting a white scar across the blue water, leaving the man to drown. The video froze on that final frame, the white wake and the small head bobbing in the vast ocean. The light from the screen bathed the ballroom in a ghostly aquatic glow, illuminating the faces of the crowd. There was no more whispering, no more screaming. The shock was physical, sucking the air out of the room. It was not a tragedy. It was not an accident. It was a cold-blooded execution captured in 4K resolution. Brandon slowly lowered the gun, his arm going limp at his side. He turned his head, looking up at the giant screen, at the undeniable evidence of his sin. He stared at his own image on the boat, at the moment he became a killer. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, but the words died in his throat. He was paralyzed by the truth, standing alone in the wash of blue light, a murderer exposed before the world. The frozen image of my son, pushing me to my death, hung above the ballroom, like a digital judgment, a vivid blue testament to the crime that had started this entire nightmare. The silence that gripped the room was absolute, a vacuum, where no one dared to breathe. Brandon stood paralyzed, his back to the guests, his eyes locked on the screen that had just stripped him of his lies. He was shaking a violent tremor that started in his knees and worked its way up to the gun still clutched in his hand. He was waiting for the police. He was waiting for the end. But I had one final scene to play. I gave the signal to the control booth through my earpiece. The spotlight that had been illuminating the stage snapped off, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. Then, with a mechanical groan, the massive double doors at the far end of the hall swung open. A single powerful beam of white light cut through the gloom, hitting me square in the chest. I didn't flinch. I stepped forward out of the shadows and into the brilliance. I wasn't wearing the salt-stained clothes of a castaway. I was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than the car Brandon had driven into the ground. My head was shaved, my face clean, my posture rigid and commanding. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a king returning to reclaim his throne. I didn't walk alone. To my right walked the county sheriff, his face grim, his hand resting on his service weapon. To my left walked the lead agent of the FBI field office, his badge gleaming on his belt. Behind us, a dozen uniformed officers flowed into the room, moving with the precision of a military unit. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock that was louder than any scream. People grabbed each other, their eyes widening as they processed the impossibility of what they were seeing. The man whose funeral they had attended, the man whose eulogy they had heard, was walking down the center aisle, alive and untouchable. I looked to the side as I walked passing the tables where my former friends and colleagues sat. I saw their jaws drop. I saw the color drain from their faces. I locked eyes with Arthur Wallace. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the terrified realization that his legal prowess couldn't save him from this. He looked at me, and then he looked at the FBI agents, and I saw him physically shrink. I looked at Megan. She was clutching the tablecloth, her knuckles white, her mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. She was staring at a ghost, a vengeful spirit that had clawed its way back from the deep to drag her down. But I didn't stop for them. I kept walking my polished shoes, clicking rhythmically on the marble floor, a steady drumbeat of approaching justice. I stopped 10 feet from the stage, directly in front of my son. Brandon slowly turned around. He looked at the police, then he looked at me. His brain couldn't process the data. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear a hallucination that wouldn't go away. The contrast between us was stark. He was covered in mud, broken and hysterical. I was pristine, calm, and alive. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow. His grip on the revolver loosened. His fingers lost their strength. The heavy metal gun slipped from his hand and clattered onto the marble floor, a sharp ringing sound that signaled his total defeat. He took a stumbling step toward me, his eyes filled with tears and terror, his voice a cracked whisper that barely carried across the silence. "Dad," he stammered. "Dad, are you real? Are you a man, or are you a ghost?" The distance between the double doors and the stage was only 50 feet, but it felt like walking across a lifetime. The crowd of socialites and business tycoons parted before me like the Red Sea, retreating not out of respect, but out of a primal instinct to avoid the blast radius of what was about to happen. I could hear their sharp intakes of breath and the rustle of expensive fabric as they stepped back. They looked at me as if I were a biblical figure, a man who had conquered death and returned to judge the living. I didn't acknowledge them. I didn't look at the waiters frozen with their trays, or the musicians clutching their instruments. My world had narrowed down to the single point of the shivering, broken man kneeling in the center of the dance floor. I stopped directly in front of him. The toes of my polished dress shoes were inches from the muddy knees of his ruined trousers. The smell coming off him was pungent, a mix of swamp water, sweat, and the sour stench of absolute terror. He looked up at me, his neck straining, his face a map of confusion and grief. He was searching my eyes for something familiar. He was looking for the father who used to take him fishing, the father who had paid his tuition, the father who had bailed him out of every mistake he had ever made. He wanted to see mercy. He wanted to see the soft, easy forgiveness that he had exploited for his entire adult life. But he didn't find William Carter, the father. He found the man who had survived 10 miles of open ocean. He found the man who had shaved his head in a rusted warehouse. He found the stranger. Brandon let out a sob, his hands hovering in the air, as if he wanted to reach out and touch me, to verify that I was solid flesh and bone, but he didn't dare. He just slumped forward, his forehead almost touching the floor, in a posture of total submission. He was waiting for me to yell, to scream, to hit him. He was waiting for the explosion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I moved with the slow, deliberate calm of an executioner. I bent at the waist, leaning down until my face was level with his. I got close enough to see the dilated pupils of his eyes, close enough to feel the heat of his erratic breathing. The room was so silent that a pin drop would have sounded like a gunshot. I wanted him to hear this. I wanted these words to be the only thing he heard for the rest of his life. I brought my lips to his ear, the same ear I had whispered bedtime stories into decades ago, and I delivered the final line of our tragedy. When you returned home, I was waiting for you. I whispered my voice, a low rumble that only he could hear. I said to him, I have got something for you too. Brandon froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He understood then. He understood that the investor, the emails, the fake money, the phone in the box, and the relentless psychological torture had all been me. I hadn't just watched him fall, I had pushed him. I straightened up, towering over him once again. I reached out my right hand. Brandon looked at it, hope flickering in his eyes for a split second, thinking I was offering him a hand up, thinking I was offering redemption. But when my hand landed on his shoulder, it didn't squeeze with affection. It clamped down hard, my fingers digging into his collarbone, pinning him to the floor. It was not an embrace. It was a shackle. I held him there, fixed in his spot, as the FBI agents moved in behind me, their handcuffs rattling in the silence. I left my son kneeling on the floor, a broken monument to his own greed, and turned my attention to the head table where the real architects of my destruction stood waiting. Megan and Wallace were no longer playing the part of the grieving widow and the supportive friend. They looked like cornered rats, their eyes darting between the FBI agents and the exits, realizing there was nowhere left to run. I walked toward them, slowly savoring every step. I reached inside my tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy leather binder. I didn't hand it to them gently. I threw it onto the pristine white tablecloth with a force that made the champagne glasses jump and shatter. The sound was like a gavel striking a judge's bench. I watched them flinch. I watched the color drain from Wallace's face as the folder slid open, revealing the contents. It wasn't just papers. It was a forensic autopsy of their crimes. Photographs of the forged deeds, transcripts of their calls to the Cayman Islands, copies of the wire transfers they had authorized only hours ago. It was the paper trail they thought they had buried under layers of corporate shell companies and legal loopholes. You thought you were playing chess, I said, my voice calm and carrying to the back of the silent room. You thought you were smarter than everyone else. You thought you could erase a man's life with a few signatures and a fake funeral. But you were just playing solitaire. I leaned in close, my hands resting on the table, looking deep into Megan's terrified eyes. I didn't just hide in that warehouse, Megan. I worked. I have been building this case for 14 days. Every time you used your phone, I was listening. Every time you sent an email, I was reading it. That investor you thought you were selling to was a federal sting operation I set up. You didn't just sign the company away. You signed a full confession to money laundering, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit capital murder. Wallace tried to speak, his lawyer instincts kicking in as a last reflex. Now see here, Bill, he stammered, his voice shaking. These are serious accusations. You can't just barge in here and... I cut him off with a look of pure, cold contempt. Save it for the jury, Arthur. I looked over my shoulder at the lead FBI agent and gave a single nod. Take them. The agents moved in with synchronized efficiency. They didn't ask them to come quietly. They spun Wallace around, slamming him against the wall and wrenching his arms behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the ballroom. Megan watched him go down, and then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She turned on him. As the female agent grabbed her wrist, Megan began to scream a high-pitched shriek of denial. It was him, she yelled, pointing a manicured finger at Wallace. It was Arthur. He is the lawyer. He planned the whole thing. He made me do it. I was scared. I didn't want to hurt anyone. He forced me. Wallace looked at her with a mixture of shock and hatred, realizing that the partner he had conspired with was feeding him to the wolves to save her own skin. I stood there amidst the ruin of their celebration, watching them drag each other down into the abyss they had dug for me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the heavy weight on my chest finally begin to lift. The screams of my daughter-in-law fading into the hallway as the agents dragged her away sounded like music, but the symphony wasn't finished yet. I turned my back on the shattered remnants of the head table and walked back to the center of the dance floor, where my son was still kneeling. He looked small. He looked like a child who had broken a window and was waiting for the strap. But this wasn't about discipline anymore. This was about erasure. Sam Rossi stepped out from the shadows of the wings. She wasn't holding a gun and she wasn't holding a badge. She was carrying a bright orange life jacket. It was cheap foam stained with grease and salt, the standard issue safety gear from our fleet. She walked up to Brandon and dropped it. It landed in his lap with a soft thud, a stark splash of color against his muddy, ruined clothes. Brandon looked down at the vest, his hands trembling as they touched the nylon. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a confusion that was almost pitiful. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why?" I stood over him, blocking out the light of the chandeliers, casting a long shadow that swallowed him whole. "You think you are going to prison for murder," I said, my voice calm and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "You think because I am standing here alive that you might get lucky. Maybe a plea deal for attempted manslaughter. Maybe a suspended sentence because it was a first offense. You are calculating the odds right now, aren't you? You are thinking you can beat this." I leaned in closer, letting a cold smile touch my lips. "That is why I didn't call the police to report a homicide, Brandon. Attempted murder is a messy charge. It is hard to prove intent. It involves juries and sympathy and expensive lawyers. And frankly, I didn't want to give you the satisfaction of being the man who almost killed Bill Carter." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. So I called the Coast Guard instead. I reported a vessel running dark. I reported a massive shipment of narcotics moving through my marina. Brandon's eyes widened, the realization hitting him like a physical slap. "The cooler," he stammered. "The white powder." I nodded slowly. 50 kilos. That is what the agents found on the Legacy. 50 kilos of bricks wrapped in plastic. I know it is baking soda and flour. You know it is baking soda and flour. But the police don't know that. Not yet. The field tests are notoriously unreliable, and right now you are the captain of a boat loaded with what looks like enough cocaine to supply Miami for a month. I watched the blood drain from his face as the math of the Florida penal system crashed down on him. In this state, trafficking that amount isn't a slap on the wrist. It is a mandatory minimum. It is no bond. It is immediate remand to a maximum security facility. You are not going to a white-collar resort, Brandon. You are going to Rayford. You are going to the Iron Triangle. By the time the lab results come back in 3 weeks, proving the drugs are fake, you will have already been processed into general population. You will be locked in a cage with the hardest men in the state, and you will be there as a rich boy who lost everything. I pointed to the life jacket resting on his knees. I brought you that because you are going to need it. You are drowning, Brandon. But this time there is no ocean. There is only concrete and steel. I watched the hope die in his eyes. He realized then the true depth of my cruelty. I hadn't just framed him. I had engineered a hell where he would be stripped of his name, his comfort, and his future. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a cautionary tale, and he was going to rot in the dark just like he had intended for me. The agents moved in, pulling him to his feet. But he was already gone, his spirit broken by the weight of the orange vest and the heavy, crushing truth of his father's revenge. The silence of the ballroom was shattered by a sound that made the stomach turn. It was the sound of a grown man reverting to a frightened child. Brandon collapsed forward, his knees hitting the marble with a sickening thud. He didn't just kneel, he crawled. He scrambled across the few inches separating us and wrapped his arms around my legs, burying his face in the fabric of my tuxedo trousers. He was sobbing, uncontrollable, heaving breaths that racked his entire body. He clutched at me like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood, desperate and pathetic. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice muffled by my clothes. "You can't let them take me. Not there. Not to Rayford." I didn't mean to do it. It was Megan. She twisted my head. She told me we had no choice. I was scared, Dad. I was just scared. I am your son. You can't do this to your own blood. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Please just tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. I looked down at the creature clutching my leg. I felt the wetness of his tears soaking into the expensive wool. A month ago, that sensation would have broken my heart. A month ago, I would have knelt down with him. I would have hired the best lawyers in the state. I would have spent every dime I had to save him from himself. But the man who would have done that died 10 miles off the coast of Key West. The man standing here felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a hollow, clinical detachment. I was looking at a stranger, a parasite that I had finally excised. I reached down and gripped his wrists. I didn't pull him up. I peeled his hands off me one finger at a time, breaking his grip with a force that made him gasp. I took a step back, creating a chasm between us that could never be bridged. I looked him dead in the eye, my face a mask of stone. "You are not sorry you did it, Brandon." I said, my voice flat and hard like granite. "You are sorry the boat didn't start. You are sorry the drugs were fake. You are sorry that I am standing here breathing. You are not apologizing for the sin, you are apologizing for the consequence. There is a difference." He looked up at me, his face streaked with mud and tears, his mouth opening to beg again, but I cut him off. "You were so afraid of the sharks in the water. You were so afraid of the sharks in the loan office. Well, I have news for you, son. Where you are going, the sharks walk on 2 legs. And they are going to smell the fear on you from the moment you walk through the gate. They are going to eat you alive. Say hello to them for me." I nodded to the agents. They stepped forward, grabbing Brandon by the arms and hauling him up. He went limp, then he started to thrash. He screamed a raw, primal sound of absolute despair. "Dad, please no! Dad, help me!" They dragged him backward, his heels skidding across the polished floor, leaving streaks of mud on the white marble. I didn't turn away. I didn't blink. I watched him go. I watched my son being carried out of my life and into the hell I had built for him. His screams faded into the corridor, then were cut off by the heavy thud of the double doors closing. I stood alone in the center of the silent ballroom. I adjusted my cuffs. I straightened my tie. The debt was paid. The ballroom was a landscape of ruin. It looked less like a gala and more like a battlefield where a very specific war had just been fought and won. Tables were overturned, white linens stained with spilled wine that looked disturbingly like blood, and shattered crystal crunched underfoot with every movement. The air was still thick with the lingering tension of the arrest. but the screaming had stopped. The chaos had been surgically removed, dragged out through the double doors in handcuffs, leaving only the stunned silence of the survivors. I stood in the exact center of the room, the epicenter of the earthquake. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of ozone and fear. I reached up and adjusted the knot of my silk tie, tightening it just a fraction. I smoothed the lapels of my tuxedo. I checked my cuffs. Everything was back in its place. Order had been restored. The sheriff walked over to me, holstering his weapon with a heavy metallic click. He looked tired, the lines on his face deep under the harsh house lights that had flickered back on. He looked around the room, shaking his head at the wreckage. "It is done, Bill," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so the gaping guests wouldn't hear. "We have the confession on tape. We have the paper trail. And we have the drugs. They aren't walking away from this." I nodded, extending my hand. The grip was firm, a silent pact between two men who understood that sometimes the law needs a heavy hand to guide it. "Thank you, Sheriff," I replied, "for letting me handle it my way, for giving me the room to close the circle." He just nodded and turned to direct his deputies, leaving me alone once more. I turned to leave. As I walked toward the exit, the crowd of Miami's elite parted from me instantly. These were men and women who controlled millions of dollars, people who were used to being the most powerful figures in any room they entered. But tonight, they looked at me with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. They shrank back, pulling their expensive gowns and suits away from me as if I were radioactive. I saw the look in their eyes. It wasn't just respect. It was the primal realization that they were in the presence of a predator. They had watched me systematically destroy my own family in the span of 10 minutes without raising my voice. They knew now that the rumors of my softness were a lie. I wasn't just Bill Carter, the salvage operator. I was the man who came back from the dead to settle a score. I didn't stop to reassure them. I didn't offer explanations or apologies for ruining their evening. They were witnessing a coronation, and kings do not apologize for reclaiming their kingdom. I walked through the lobby, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the marble, steady and rhythmic. The hotel staff stood frozen behind the front desk, eyes wide, watching the ghost walk out the front door. I stepped out into the humid night air. The humidity hit me thick and familiar, the smell of the ocean drifting in from the east. Outside the scene was a flashing kaleidoscope of red and blue lights. A line of patrol cars blocked the driveway. Near the curb, two agents were shoving a screaming woman into the back of a black SUV. It was Megan. Her silver dress was torn, her hair a wild mess, and she was still shrieking, still trying to blame the world for her downfall. She saw me. She stopped fighting for a second, her eyes locking onto mine, pleading for a savior she had tried to kill. I didn't break stride. I didn't frown. I didn't smile. I simply looked through her as if she were made of glass, as if she were already a memory fading in the rear-view mirror. I turned my collar up against the breeze and walked toward the waiting limousine, leaving the trash to be collected by the authorities. The waiting room of the state penitentiary smelled of antiseptic cleaner and old fear. It was a sterile gray box where the free world briefly intersected with the damned. I sat on a metal stool on the visitor's side of the reinforced glass partition, my hands folded calmly on the stainless steel ledge. It had been 6 months since the night at the Grand Hotel. 6 months since the gavel came down. Outside, the sun was shining on a beautiful Florida afternoon, but in here, there was no weather. There was only the hum of fluorescent lights and the heavy clank of locking mechanisms. The buzzer on the far side of the room sounded a harsh grating noise that made the other visitors flinch. The heavy steel door slid open. A guard stepped out, followed by a prisoner. I almost didn't recognize him. Brandon shuffled into the room, his ankles shackled, his movements slow and pained. The expensive suits and the arrogant posture were gone, replaced by a faded blue jumpsuit that hung loosely on his skeletal frame. He had lost at least 30 pounds. His head was shaved, revealing a jagged healing scar that ran from his ear down to his neck. His face was a map of misery, bruised and gaunt. his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if he expected a blow to come from the shadows. The sharks I had warned him about had evidently been feeding. He sat down opposite me, wincing as his ribs touched the hard chair. He picked up the black phone receiver, his hand shaking with a tremor that looked permanent. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He just stared at me through the smudged glass, his eyes filling with a mixture of hatred and despair. Why, he rasped, his voice sounding like it hadn't been used in days. Why didn't you just kill me? You had the gun. You had the chance on the boat. You could have ended it. Why did you send me here? I picked up my receiver, watching him closely. I saw the desperation in his plea. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was asking why I hadn't granted him the mercy of execution. I leaned forward, my voice steady and cold through the wire. Death is an escape, Brandon. It is a release. If I had shot you on that dock, or let you drown in the canal, it would have been over in seconds. You would have faded to black. There is no suffering in the dark. I paused, watching a tear track through the grime on his cheek. I didn't want you to escape. I wanted you to live. I want you to wake up every single morning in that cage for the next 20 years. I want you to stare at the concrete ceiling and think about the soft bed you used to sleep in. I want you to eat the slop they serve you and remember the taste of the steak dinners we shared. I pressed my hand against the glass. You had everything, son. You had a father who loved you more than his own life. You had a fortune waiting for you. You had the world in your pocket. And you didn't lose it because of bad luck. You didn't lose it because of the economy. You looked at all of that love and security and you threw it into the ocean because you were greedy. That is your real sentence, not the time. It is the memory. I want you to sit in this hell every day and know that you built the walls yourself. I hung up the phone. The click was final. Brandon started to scream, slamming his fist against the glass, mouthing words I couldn't hear, but I didn't stay to read his lips. I stood up and buttoned my jacket, turning my back on the monster I had created and the man I had destroyed. I walked out of the prison and into the blinding sunlight, leaving him alone with the ghosts of the life he had murdered. The ink on the final contract was barely dry when I walked out of the glass tower in downtown Miami for the last time. I had just dismantled an empire that took me 40 years to build. Carter Marine Salvage was no more. I sold the fleet. I sold the waterfront property. I sold the cranes and the warehouses and the very name that had been painted on the hull of every tugboat I owned. The buyers were a logistics conglomerate from Europe who didn't care about the history or the blood that had been spilled on those docks. To them, it was just assets and inventory. To me, it was a heavy coat I was finally taking off in the middle of a heat wave. I didn't keep the money. The millions that wired into my account didn't sit there for more than an hour. I had already set up the trust with a different law firm, one that had nothing to do with Arthur Wallace. I poured every single cent into a new initiative I called the Second Chance Foundation. It was designed to provide housing and education for orphans who had no one to look out for them, and for veterans who had returned from war with scars the world refused to see. I made sure the bylaws were ironclad. Not a single penny would ever go to anyone carrying the last name Carter. My legacy would not be a spoiled son destroying his family for greed. My legacy would be strangers getting the help I wished I could have given Brandon before it was too late. I drove down to the marina as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Sam Rossi was waiting for me at the end of Pier 4. She wasn't wearing the severe business suit of the investment banker or the grease-stained jumpsuit of the mechanic. She was wearing jeans and a windbreaker, looking like the young woman she actually was. I walked up to her and handed her a thick manila envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for an amount that would ensure she never had to work another dangerous job again. She took it, but she didn't look at the money. She looked at me with a question in her eyes. "I have one more thing for you," I said, gesturing to the slip behind her. Bobbing gently in the water was the legacy. The forensic tape was gone. The hull had been scrubbed clean of the mud and the memories. I had a crew come in overnight to reinstall the propellers and tune the engines. She is yours, Sam. She is fully fueled and ready for open water. Take her. Go explore the world. Just don't stay in one place too long. Sam looked at the boat, the vessel that had been the stage for my murder and my resurrection. She ran her hand along the polished railing. You are giving me the flagship, she asked softly. I smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on my face. It is just a boat, Sam. It is fiberglass and metal. The curse is gone. She turned back to me, clutching the envelope and the keys. Thank you, Bill, for everything. She paused, the wind catching her hair. But what about you? You have no home. You have no company. You have no family. Where will you go? I looked out at the horizon where the dark water met the darkening sky. The world was vast, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't tethered to it by debts or expectations, or the heavy anchor of fatherhood. I turned up the collar of my jacket and looked at her one last time. I am going to a place where no one knows my name, I said. I turned and walked away down the long wooden pier, disappearing into the twilight, leaving the ghosts behind me forever. The water here was different. It didn't smell of diesel and betrayal and humid Florida rot. It smelled of salt and clean wind and ancient things. I sat alone in the center of a small wooden dory that I had bought for cash from a local fisherman who didn't speak my language and didn't care about my past. He didn't know I was a ghost. He just saw an old man with sad eyes who paid in crisp bills. There were no satellites overhead tracking my movements. There were no security cameras watching my every step. There were no suns plotting to kill me in the dark. Just the rhythmic slap of the gentle waves against the hull and the slow, majestic descent of a blood-red sun sinking into the Pacific. I held a simple hand line between my fingers, feeling the faint tug of the current, but I wasn't trying to catch anything. I wasn't hunting anymore. I was just practicing the art of being nothing. For 40 years, I was Bill Carter, the salvage king, the man who could pull steel from the abyss and turn disaster into gold. Now I was just a silhouette in a straw hat drifting on the tide. It was a strange sensation, this lightness. It felt like I had shed a heavy metal skin that had been suffocating me for decades. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool evening air, letting it wash away the stale scent of the courtroom and the prison. I reached into the deep pocket of my linen trousers, and my fingers closed around a cold, hard object wrapped in thick plastic. I pulled it out. It was the phone. The device that had recorded the first lie. The device Brandon had tossed into the wake of the legacy, thinking he was tossing away his conscience along with it. I had dived for it that night in the murky canal water. I had kept it through the long nights in the warehouse, through the planning and the execution of my revenge. It had been my talisman, my fuel. It reminded me of the hatred when my resolve started to waver. It was the physical proof of the knife in my back. I unwrapped the plastic, slowly letting the sea breeze catch the wrapper and carry it away like a white bird. I held the device in my palm. It was corroded now, the screen cracked into a spider web of fractures, the internal circuits destroyed by salt water. It was a dead thing, a relic of a war that was already over. I ran my thumb over the shattered glass one last time. I thought about Brandon sitting in his cell right now, staring at the gray concrete wall, waiting for the lights to go out. I thought about the man I used to be, the father who tried so hard to build a dynasty that he forgot to build a son. I didn't need this anchor anymore. I didn't need the anger to keep me warm. The sun was almost gone now, leaving a purple bruise on the horizon line. I stood up carefully, the small boat rocking gently beneath my feet. I pulled my arm back, feeling the stretch in my shoulder, the same shoulder that had carried the weight of a company and a family for too long. I didn't hesitate. I threw the phone with everything I had left. It tumbled through the air end over end, catching the last dying light of the day before it hit the surface. Splash. It broke the absolute stillness, sending concentric rings expanding outward until they faded into nothing. The ocean swallowed it whole, just as it swallows everything eventually. I looked down into the darkening depths, the deep indigo water that went down for miles. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I spoke to the silence, addressing the creatures that patrolled the darkness below the ones I had made a pact with when I was floating alone and dying in the Gulf. "Hello, sharks," I whispered to the vast emptiness. I kept my promise. The water rippled one last time, and then the night took us both. The tragedy of the Carter family serves as a brutal reminder that wealth built without character is a castle built on sand. Bill's greatest failure wasn't in business, but in shielding his son from the necessary pain of failure, creating a man who valued inheritance over humanity. Brandon's downfall illustrates that greed is a corrosive force that eats away at the soul until there is nothing left but fear. True legacy isn't about the money you leave for your children, but the values you leave in them. When we sacrifice morality for a shortcut, we don't just lose our way, we lose ourselves. If this story of betrayal and cold redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that follow button now for more gripping tales of human nature and justice.